They called her fat to her face. Foreman Caleb Rourke said it loud enough for 3 ranch hands to hear, said it, while Margaret Ellison was still climbing down from the wagon, her boy Danny clutching her coat, the Wyoming wind cutting through both of them like a blade through wet paper. Caleb didn't whisper it. He didn't wait until she was out of earshot. He looked at the man beside him, jerked his chin toward her, and said, "Hale's lost his mind. What's that woman going to do out here? Sit on the cattle?" The laughter that followed was the kind that carries. Margaret heard every word. She set her foot on the frozen ground, steadied herself, and did not look at him. Not yet. If you've ever been laughed at for simply existing, stay with this story, because what happens next will change how you think about strength forever. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what's coming. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far Margaret's story travels. The wagon had taken 11 days to reach the Hale Ranch from Laramie, and those 11 days had been the kind of miserable that doesn't clean off. The driver, a leathery man named Stu, who chewed tobacco and spoke only when absolutely necessary, had warned Margaret on the 3rd day that the passes were getting unpredictable, told him she understood. She didn't understand. Not fully. She'd grown up in Columbus, Ohio, where winter meant gray skies and muddy streets, not this vast white silence that swallowed everything and gave nothing back. She'd said she understood because she needed to get to that ranch. She needed the work, the shelter, and the distance from everything she was leaving behind. Danny was 7. He'd spent most of the journey pressed against her side, watching the mountains like they were something from a picture book, which they were to him. He'd never seen mountains before 3 weeks ago. He hadn't said much since they left Columbus. He'd barely said much since his father died 8 months back, and Margaret had learned not to push him. Kids carried grief in ways that didn't always come out in words. Sometimes it came out in silence. Sometimes it came out at 2 in the morning, when she'd wake to find him standing at the foot of her bed, not crying, just standing there, needing to confirm she was still breathing. She was always still breathing. That was the one promise she made to herself after Thomas died. She would keep breathing, keep moving, keep finding the next solid thing to hold on to. The Hale Ranch was the next solid thing. She'd answered the advertisement in the Laramie paper. Housekeeper and cook needed for working cattle ranch, 40 miles east of Casper. Room and board provided. References required. Inquire in care of Nathan Hale. She'd written 3 drafts of her letter before she sent the final one. She'd listed her experience honestly: 12 years keeping house, 7 of those raising a child alongside it, 4 seasons working in her aunt's boarding house in Cincinnati, where she'd cooked for up to 20 people at a stretch. She hadn't included a photograph because the advertisement hadn't asked for one, and she'd told herself that meant it didn't matter. Nathan Hale's response had come 2 weeks later. Brief, practical, no excess warmth, but no coldness either. He needed someone reliable. He had 2 children, 8 and 10. The last housekeeper had left in September, and they'd been managing poorly since. Could she start by the 1st of December? She could. She hadn't told him about her size in the letter. It hadn't seemed relevant. Now, standing in the mud and frozen grass of the Hale Ranch yard, with Caleb Rourke's laughter still hanging in the cold air, she wondered if she should have. No, she pushed that thought down before it could take root. She had not survived a dead husband, a foreclosed house, 7 months of near poverty, and 11 days in a rattling wagon just to start apologizing for herself in a stranger's yard. She lifted Danny down from the wagon, took his hand, and walked toward the house. Caleb Rourke was standing near the fence with 2 ranch hands, a young one who looked about 19 and hadn't fully grown into his boots yet, and an older one with a gray beard who had the decency to look at the ground when Margaret walked past. Caleb himself didn't move. He was a tall man, not heavy, but solid in the way that men who've worked outdoors their whole lives get solid-weathered, hard-angled, with eyes that had developed the habit of measuring everything they landed on and finding it wanting. He was measuring Margaret now. "Mrs. Ellison," he said. Not a greeting, a confirmation that he'd been told her name and was choosing to use it as a kind of test. "That's right," she said. She stopped walking. She turned and looked at him directly, which seemed to catch him slightly off guard, not enough to show on his face, but enough that she noticed the half-second pause. "And you're the foreman, Mr. Rourke. Caleb's fine." "Mr. Rourke is fine too," she said, and kept walking. She heard one of the ranch hands make a sound that might have been a swallowed laugh. The house was not what she'd imagined, which she'd been careful not to imagine too specifically. It was large enough, 2 stories, solid timber construction, a covered porch running the full length of the front, but it had the look of a place that had been enduring rather than living. Porch boards needed attention. A shutter on the second floor was hanging at a wrong angle. The window nearest the door had a crack patched with what appeared to be a rag stuffed into the frame. Inside was worse, in the ways that mattered more. The kitchen was functional, but grimy in the corners, the kind of grime that accumulates when someone has been cleaning only the surfaces that company might see and ignoring everything else. The main room had furniture arranged with no particular logic, like pieces that had been moved in a hurry and never properly settled. There was a cold fireplace with ash in it that hadn't been cleared in what looked like several days. A child's boot sat on the stairs. A coffee cup sat on the floor beside a chair with a ring under it that had had time to dry and re-dry. Nathan Hale was standing near the fireplace when she came in. He was younger than she'd expected, mid-30s, lean with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of months of not enough sleep. He had the posture of a man who was holding himself upright through effort rather than ease. His handshake was firm and quick, the kind that got the business over with. "Mrs. Ellison." "Long journey." "It was," she said. "Thank you for having us." He looked at Danny, who looked back at him with the particular solemnity of a child who has learned to size up rooms and the adults in them before deciding how to behave. Nathan nodded at him. Danny nodded back. Margaret thought that was probably the most they'd communicate for a while, and she was fine with that. "I'll show you your room," Nathan said. "Children are with Mrs. Peavy in town today, back before supper." "Kitchens," he stopped. Seemed to decide something. "Kitchen needs work." "I know that." "I'll get started," she said. "Today you just arrived." "I know. But you said supper needs to be ready, and I haven't seen what I'm working with yet." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read, not quite surprise, not quite assessment. Something in between. Then he said rooms this way and led her upstairs. The room was small but clean, which she appreciated. Someone had made an effort there, at least fresh linens, a window that looked out onto the yard and the mountains beyond it. Danny pressed his nose to the glass immediately. Margaret set her bag on the narrow bed and stood for a moment, just breathing. 11 days, a dead husband. A foreclosed house. A letter sent into the dark. She was here. That was enough for right now. She went downstairs and started in on the kitchen. She worked the way she always worked, methodically, without fuss, starting with what she could see, and then moving to what she couldn't. The ash pan under the stove hadn't been emptied in too long. The wood box beside it was half empty, and the wood in it was damp, which meant someone had stacked it green or it had gotten wet. She found dry wood in a covered lean-to she located by following the path worn through the yard, a path that told her someone, probably Nathan, had been making this walk twice a day to bring in wood for a house that was too cold, because they didn't understand that you had to keep the box full and dry to get a fire that actually heated a room and not just the air directly above it. She made a mental note about the wood. She'd address it later. One thing at a time. The pantry was the real discovery. She stood in front of it for a solid 2 minutes. There was more here than she'd expected, not organized, not intelligently arranged, but present. Flour, cornmeal, dried beans, salt pork, canned goods pushed to the back, a crock of lard, dried apples in a paper bag. There was a wheel of hard cheese on the bottom shelf that was rinded but not spoiled. Smoked bacon hanging on a hook. She counted and calculated quickly, the way she'd learned to in the lean years, not panic calculating but competence calculating, taking inventory of what she had to work with. She had enough. More than enough if she was smart about it. She started the fire first. Got it right, small dry kindling, then larger pieces, draft open until it was drawing properly, then adjusted. Stove began to warm within 15 minutes in a way that she suspected it hadn't in quite some time. You'd feel the difference in the kitchen almost immediately. A change in the quality of the cold air, the first edges of actual warmth starting to build. She was making broth from the smoked bacon and dried beans, a process that took time but could be started early and left mostly alone when she heard boots on the porch. Caleb Rourke came through the kitchen door without knocking. He looked at her. He looked at the stove. He looked at the pot. He looked back at her. "What are you making?" he said. "Broth for now. Supper later." "With what?" she told him. He made a face that suggested he'd expected something more impressive or something less. She couldn't tell which. "Ranch hands eat at the bunkhouse," he said, Mrs. Dunmore used to send a pot over. "I'll continue that," Margaret said. "Is the bunkhouse stove working properly?" He blinked. That wasn't the answer he'd been preparing for. "It works." "Good. Then I can send over something substantial and they can keep it warm themselves. She stirred the pot once. How many hands right now? 6 plus me. 7 men. All right, she did the calculation. I'll need the wood box kept full. I've seen how the system works if someone could stack it dry and covered, not just pile it against the side of the house. That would help. Caleb stared at her for a moment. He seemed to be deciding whether to respond with authority or hostility, and settled on a version of the former. That's not your department. No, she agreed, it's yours. I'm just telling you what helps the kitchen work, and you can decide what to do with that. He left without another word. She went back to her broth. The Hale children came home at 4 o'clock in a wagon driven by Mrs. Peavy, a stout woman from Casper who managed the general store and apparently served as an informal childminder when Nathan Hale had no other arrangements. She helped the children down, watched them go inside, and then looked at the smoke coming from the kitchen chimney with an expression of visible relief. You must be Mrs. Ellison, she said. I am, Mabel Peavy. She lowered her voice, glancing at the house. Those children need somebody steady. Their daddy does his best, but he's got the ranch and the hands and the she stopped. Reconsidered, he's been managing. But barely, I understand. Mabel looked at her with the frank appraisal of a woman who'd seen enough of life not to waste time on subtlety. You ever worked a frontier ranch before? No, Margaret said. I've worked a boarding house, a household with 6 children that wasn't mine, and my own home for 12 years. I learn fast and I don't quit. Mabel seemed to find this acceptable. The boy, she said, nodding toward the house, where Danny had followed the Hale children inside with the wariness of a cat entering a new room. He's quiet. He lost his father 8 months ago. Mabel's expression shifted into something softer and less appraising. Poor little thing. He's all right, Margaret said, and meant it in the most complicated way that phrase can be meant. He was all right. He was also not all right. Both things were true and probably would be for a while. The Hale children were named Clara, who was 10 and had her father's dark circles, and her mother's eyes. Margaret knew about the mother from the letter. Nathan Hale had mentioned briefly that his wife had passed 18 months prior, and James, who was 8, and currently going through a phase of expressing all difficult emotions by hitting things. He'd apparently hit the door frame 3 times since coming home. Margaret had heard it from the kitchen. She went into the main room while supper was still an hour away, because she'd learned that you couldn't let certain things just resolve themselves. Sometimes you had to walk toward them. James was standing at the window, looking out with his arms crossed and his jaw set. Margaret sat down in the chair nearest him, not close enough to feel intrusive. Just present. Rough day, she said. He didn't answer. I've had rough days, she said. Usually feel better after supper. Sometimes not. Sometimes supper doesn't fix it. James cut his eyes at her sideways. Are you the new housekeeper? I am. The last one left. I heard. She said it was too hard, he said, with the particular contempt that 8-year-old boys deploy when adults have disappointed them badly enough. She said the winters were too hard. What do you think? Margaret asked. He blinked, not expecting to be asked. I think she was soft. Maybe, Margaret said. Or maybe it just wasn't the right fit. Not everybody's cut out for the same thing. She paused. I grew up in Ohio. I've never wintered here before. I might find things I'm not prepared for. James looked at her with something approaching interest now, despite himself. Then why'd you come? Because I needed to, she said simply. And because I think I can manage. Those aren't the same as being sure. He thought about that. After a moment, he uncrossed his arms, which was not exactly a transformation, but was something. Clara appeared in the doorway. She had a book under her arm, and the expression of a child who has decided the safest strategy is to observe everything and commit to nothing. She looked at Margaret with careful, measuring eyes. Supper smells good, she said. Bean and bacon broth tonight, Margaret told her. Tomorrow I'll do better. I need to see what's in the smokehouse and the cellar, James said. Clara rolled her eyes with the authority of a sibling who has spent 2 years being 10 while he was 8. Papa told you about the cellar. He said there was one. He didn't say what was in it. There's probably things in it, Margaret said. Want to help me find out in the morning? James looked at her with the expression of a child being offered something he wanted and was suspicious of wanting. Maybe, he said, which meant yes. Supper that night was plain but hot, and there was enough of it, which Margaret had learned were the 2 most important things. Nathan Hale ate quietly and said the broth was good. Caleb Rourke had apparently elected to eat in the bunkhouse rather than at the house, which Margaret considered a small mercy. Danny ate everything in his bowl and then, for the first time in several days, asked if there was more. There was more. After supper, Nathan Hales sat at the kitchen table while Margaret washed up. It wasn't companionable silence exactly. It was the silence of two people in the same room who haven't figured out the shape of the space between them yet. "Got the household under control," he said finally. It was not quite a compliment and not quite a statement. It was the thing a man says when he's been surprised but doesn't want to make too much of it. "Starting to," she said. "I want to look at the cellar in the morning. And the smokehouse. And the woodbox system needs to change. You're losing heat efficiency because the wood's coming in damp." A pause. "Caleb manages the woodbox." "I know, I mentioned it to him." She set a bowl on the shelf. "I'm not trying to step on anyone's toes, Mr. Hale. I just know what works in a kitchen and what doesn't." Another pause. "Nathan," he said. "You can call me Nathan." She turned and looked at him. He was looking at the table, not at her. There was something tired in his face that wasn't just the tiredness of a long day. It was the tiredness of a long time. "All right," she said, "Nathan." He nodded once and stood. "Storm glass in the hall's been dropping since this afternoon," he said. "We might get weather." Margaret looked out the black square of the kitchen window, where the wind had started doing something purposeful. "How bad does it get here?" "Bad enough." He picked up his coat from the hook by the door. "Sleep well, Mrs. Ellison." "Margaret," she said. He paused at the door. Nodded once more, the way a man does when he's acknowledged something he wasn't quite ready for. Then he went out. She finished washing up. She checked on Danny, who was asleep in the small room beside hers, curled on his side with his mouth slightly open, the way he'd slept since he was 3. She stood in the doorway watching him breathe for a moment. Then she went to the window at the end of the hall. The mountains were invisible in the dark, but she could feel them, that particular weight and silence. That meant something vast and indifferent was out there. Not hostile, just enormous, waiting to see whether the small things moving around at its feet were worth its attention. The wind moved against the glass. Storm glass Nathan had mentioned was in a brass frame on the wall nearby, and she looked at it. The liquid inside had gone cloudy at the bottom, which she'd learned in her father's house meant pressure dropping, weather building. She'd been on this ranch for 7 hours. In that 7 hours, she'd started a fire, made supper for 9 people, navigated a hostile foreman, made tentative contact with 2 grieving children and 1 grieving man, and found more usable resources in the pantry than anyone seemed to have noticed. She was exhausted in the specific, solid way of work done rather than the hollow way of worry. She went to bed. The storm hit at 3 in the morning with the kind of sound that makes you understand, if you've never understood it before, why people used to believe weather was alive and angry. Didn't approach, it arrived, all at once, a wall of wind and snow that struck the house like a decision. Margaret was awake before the sound fully registered, sitting up with her heart going fast in the animal way of a body that knows danger before the mind catches up. She sat still and listened. The house was holding. The shutters were banging the loose one on the second floor especially, and the wind was finding every gap and crack and pushing through them, and the temperature inside was already noticeably dropping in the 20 seconds she'd been sitting up. She got dressed in the dark, added her coat over her clothes, put on her boots. In the hallway, Danny's door was open. He was sitting up in bed with his eyes wide. "Mama?" "Storm," she said. "Stay here and stay warm. I'm going to check the stove. Is it bad?" She could feel the cold coming through the walls. The window at the end of the hall was rattling. "It's a big storm," she said, because she didn't believe in lying to children about things they could feel for themselves. "The house is solid and the stove is good. I'm going to keep it going." She went downstairs. The kitchen was cold in a way it hadn't been when she'd gone to bed, not dangerously cold yet, but the kind of cold that meant the fire in the stove had banked down and the wind was pulling heat through the walls faster than the residual warmth could replace it. She got the fire going again, properly, methodically, the way she'd done it 7 hours ago, and stood over it until she was sure it was catching. She heard footsteps on the stairs. Nathan came in, fully dressed, his hair standing at a strange angle from sleep. He looked at the stove and then at her. "How long has it been going?" he said. 3 minutes. It'll be full heat in 20. He nodded slowly, looking at the window. The glass was white, not frost from inside, but snow driven against it from outside, building already. "This is a bad one," he said. "How bad?" "Could go 12 hours. Could go more." He moved to the window and looked at it, with the expression of a man performing a rapid, well-practiced calculation. "The hands in the bunkhouse, the stove in there's not reliable. I need to get out there. You can't go out in this." "I know my ranch," he said, but he said it without hostility. Just the flat certainty of a man who had made this kind of decision before. The bunkhouse is 40 feet. I've done it in worse. Then go, she said. But take a rope. Is there one on the porch? He looked at her. Yes. Tie it to the porch post and keep hold of it. Don't trust your eyes in this, you trust the rope. Another look. Longer this time. You've done this before? I know the principle, she said. Practical sense. Same as I know you don't let the fire die in a house full of children in a blizzard. He got the rope. She watched him tie one end to the porch post through the barely open door, letting in a blade of cold that made her teeth want to clench, and then he went into the white. She shut the door. She stood for a moment with her hand on the wood of it, feeling the storm through the frame. Then she started thinking about the day ahead, all of it, the whole calculation, because that was what this moment required, and she was, if nothing else, good at seeing what a situation required. 13 people in this house and the bunkhouse. A blizzard that could run better than a day. A kitchen that now had a good fire and a pantry she'd already inventoried. She went to the pantry and started planning. By the time Nathan came back ice-crusted, breathing hard, a line of snow along one eyebrow that he wiped away without comment, she had two things ready for him. A hot cup of coffee and a list. He took the coffee first, warmed his hands on it. Then he looked at the list. It wasn't a formal list, just a piece of paper she'd found in the kitchen drawer and written on in her clear, unpretty handwriting. Bunkhouse hands, can they get here safely? How much dry wood is stacked under cover? Is the cellar accessible from the outside or only through the house? Children, where do they sleep? Is it warm enough? Water? What's the pump situation? He read it twice, set down his coffee. The hands can't cross in this, he said. Wind's worse than it sounds from in here. They stay in the bunkhouse. They keep their stove going. I got it started properly and left them enough wood for the first 8 hours. He looked at the list again. Dry wood's under the lean-to, maybe 2 days' worth if we're careful. Cellars inside only, doors off the back hallway. Pumps in the kitchen, thank God. The children, he stopped. Cold, she said. I could hear it in Danny's room. Stairs loses heat faster. No insulation worth talking about on the north wall. He said it like a man repeating something he'd known about and hadn't gotten around to, which was probably exactly what it was. Then we bring them down, she said. All 4 children in the main room today. Close off the upstairs. Keep the heat on this floor. He thought about it, nodded. And the bunkhouse men, can someone get food to them in a lull? Maybe. I'll try in daylight if there's a break. She nodded. I'll have something ready. Something they can keep warm, without me being there to manage it. He looked at her across the kitchen table in the early morning dark of a Wyoming blizzard. Outside, the storm was doing everything it had said it was going to do when it hit the storm glass yesterday afternoon. The house was holding, the fire was right. You planned this fast, he said. Planned it as soon as I heard the wind, she said. Couldn't sleep and the storm was coming, so I planned. Most people panic. Panicking takes the same energy as thinking, she said. But it gets you less. He was quiet for a moment. Then Caleb's in the bunkhouse. He's better with the men than I am in a situation like this. He'll keep them steady. Good, she said. And then, because it was true, and because she thought it mattered to say it, he doesn't like me. I know. That's all right. I'm not here to be liked. Nathan wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. What are you here for? She thought about Thomas, about Columbus, about Danny standing at the foot of her bed at 2 in the morning to confirm she was still there. To do the work, she said. Whatever the work is. He didn't say anything to that, but the silence that came after it was different from the silence that had come before it. It had less distance in it. Not warmth exactly, but something closer to it than they'd started with. Storm went on outside, relentless and enormous. Inside, the fire Margaret had built was doing what good fires do when they're built right, burning steady and hot, giving off real heat, not just the appearance of it. She went back to her planning. She was going to need everything she'd seen in that pantry, going to need the cellar and whatever was in it. She was going to need the smoked meat from the smokehouse if someone could get to it, and she'd already started working out who and when and how. 13 people, a blizzard that had meant business from the first second, a ranch that had been barely managing before she arrived. She set down her pen. She was not afraid. She was not confident either, not in the comfortable, uncomplicated way. She was something more specific than either of those things. She was steady, which is different. Steadiness isn't the absence of doubt. It's the decision to act anyway. She picked up her pen and kept writing. Outside, Wyoming did what Wyoming does in December. It did not care whether you were ready. It did not care whether you deserved it. It came with everything it had, indifferent and absolute, and the only question it ever asked of anyone was whether they would still be standing when it was done. Margaret Ellison had heard that question before, not from a blizzard, from life, and she had answered it imperfectly and without grace, the same way every time. She was still standing. She planned to keep it that way. The cellar door was in the back hallway, half hidden behind a coat rack that had been pushed against it at some point and never moved back. Margaret found it at 5:30 in the morning while Nathan was upstairs waking the children and getting them settled to come down. She stood looking at that coat rack for a moment, with a particular feeling she recognized, the feeling of something that had been overlooked so long it had become invisible. She moved the coat rack herself. It was heavy, and she had to angle it out in stages, and she scraped her knuckle on the latch doing it, and that was fine. Small pain, she'd had worse. The cellar door opened down on a steep wooden staircase that disappeared into cold dark. She found a lantern on the hook to the left of the door. Someone had put it there deliberately, which meant someone had planned ahead once, even if that planning had been a long time ago, and lit it with a match from her coat pocket. She went down. What she found there changed her calculations entirely. It wasn't a full-root cellar in the way she'd hoped. She'd been hoping for a proper storage operation, the kind her aunt had kept in Cincinnati, where shelves ran floor to ceiling and everything was dated and organized. This was rougher than that, but it was substantial. Rows of sealed crocks that turned out to be preserved vegetables, green beans, beets, what looked like corn. Sacks of potatoes in the corner, most of them still good. A few going soft that she'd need to use first. A barrel of dried apples she hadn't seen upstairs. 2 wheels of hard cheese wrapped in waxed cloth. A wooden case of canned goods peaches, mostly, and 1 tomatoes that someone had pushed to the far wall and apparently forgotten. And against the back wall, wrapped in burlap and tied with twine, 3 smoked hams. Margaret stood in the lantern light, looking at those hams for a long moment. She had not expected hams. She had been planning around the salt pork and the dried beans and what she'd seen in the pantry. Hams changed things considerably. Hams meant she could feed 13 people, properly feed them, not just sustain them through whatever this storm decided to do. She climbed back up with the lantern, her mind already reshuffling everything. Nathan was in the kitchen with Clara and James, who had come downstairs in their nightclothes and blankets, and were standing near the stove with the cautious look of children, who know something serious is happening, but haven't been told the whole of it. Danny appeared from the hallway a moment later, fully dressed, because Danny always dressed himself before presenting to anyone he'd started doing that after his father died, and Margaret thought it was his particular way of saying, "I am managing. I am fine. Don't worry about me," which was both admirable and heartbreaking. "There are 3 smoked hams in the cellar," Margaret said. Nathan looked up from where he'd been crouching to check the firebox. I forgot about those. Those were from the fall slaughter. I wasn't sure if they'd keep." "They kept," she said, "and there's preserved vegetables. Potatoes. Dried apples, more than I saw in the pantry." "How long will it hold?" he said. "If I'm careful, and I will be 4 days of full meals for everyone in this house, plus something substantial for the bunkhouse once a day." She looked at the window. The light coming through it was the gray white of a storm morning, flat and without shadow. "Do you think it will go 4 days?" "No," he said. "But I've been wrong before." Clarissa was looking at Margaret with sharp attention. "What does careful mean?" she said. "When you said, 'if I'm careful.'" Margaret turned to her. "It means no waste. It means we use what we have in the right order, softest things first, things that keep best last. It means everyone eats, but nobody eats more than they need, and nobody complains about it." Clara absorbed this. James complains. "I don't always complain," James said, though his tone suggested this was a point of active dispute. "You complained about the broth last night. I said it needed salt. That's an observation. Same thing." Margaret went to the stove, because the conversation was going to continue with or without her, and it was doing the work that needed to be done. James and Clara were talking to each other, which was better than either of them, standing at a window, looking at weather they couldn't control. She started building the morning's first serious production. The ham went into the largest pot she had with water and dried beans that she'd put to soak the night before she'd done that on instinct, not knowing yet what the morning would bring, because soaking beans was the kind of thing you did when you were thinking ahead. Now the instinct was earning its keep. The beans would be ready by midday. The ham would give the broth a depth that salt pork alone couldn't match, and the meat itself, once it came off the bone, would feed the house for 2 meals. While the pot came to its first heat, she started on breakfast. Cornmeal mush with dried apples cooked into it, not elegant, but warm and filling in the particular way that cold mornings demanded. She made enough for the 4 children, and Nathan and herself, and she put an extra portion aside. That extra portion was for Caleb Rourke, if anyone managed to get to the bunkhouse. She didn't know why she did that. She thought about it while she stirred the mush. She didn't like Caleb Rourke. She didn't need his approval, and she'd already demonstrated that to him and to herself. But he was out there in a bunkhouse with 6 other men, keeping a bad stove going in a blizzard, and whatever he thought of her, he hadn't eaten since supper last night. Hunger had no opinions about who deserved it. She knew that better than most. So she made the extra portion. She'd figure out what to do with it when the moment came. The storm did not improve with daylight. If anything, it found new arguments for itself. The wind shifted direction twice in the first 2 hours of morning, which Nathan said was a bad sign, meant the system was rotating and would hold longer than a straight-line blow. He stood at the window drinking his coffee with the posture of a man watching something he'd seen before and respected, even though he didn't like it. The children had arranged themselves in the main room in a way that happened organically and told Margaret a great deal about how the household normally worked. Clara was on the settee with her book positioned where she could see both the front window and the kitchen doorway, the observation post of a child who had learned that information was a form of safety. James was on the floor near the stove with a wooden horse he'd brought down from upstairs, staging some slow-moving drama with it that involved a lot of quiet sound effects under his breath. Danny was in the corner chair that was slightly too big for him, watching James with the focused attention of a child who wanted to join in and wasn't sure he'd been invited. Margaret noticed all of this from the kitchen doorway while her ham pot did its work. She let it sit for a moment. Then she said, from the doorway, not directing it at anyone in particular, "Danny, you know anything about horses?" Danny looked up. "A little papa took me to see some once." James's hand stilled on the wooden horse. He looked at Danny sideways. "James knows a lot about horses," Margaret said, and went back to the kitchen. She heard 30 seconds later James say something to Danny in a low voice. Couldn't hear the words. She heard Danny answer. Then James said something else, and this time his voice had the particular quality of a boy who has decided to be an expert to someone who will actually listen. She stirred her pot and said nothing. It was Nathan who figured out, around 9 in the morning, that the barn situation was going to become a problem. He came into the kitchen from his office, where he'd been going over something, and the look on his face was the specific look of a man who has just added 2 numbers and not liked the answer. "The horses," he said. Margaret turned. "I got them fed and watered before the storm hit last night," he said, "but that was 12 hours ago. And in this cold, with the stress of the storm, they'll need checking. Feed water. The trough might be frozen. How far is the barn? Farther than the bunkhouse. 100 feet, maybe a little more. And the drift's going to be building against the east side of everything." She looked at him. She didn't say you can't go out in this, because she'd already established that he was a grown man who knew his ranch, and also because she could see on his face that the question wasn't whether to go but how. "The rope from the porch," she said. "It'll reach the bunkhouse, not the barn. Is there more rope?" "In the outbuildings, the cellar. There might be in the tack room, but I'd have to get to the barn to get it." They both recognized the circularity of that for a moment. "The hands," she said. "If Caleb could get the bunkhouse, could any of them navigate the barn from there?" Is there a line already or a fence they could follow? Nathan thought. "Fence line runs from the bunkhouse corner to the barn's east wall. You could follow it. It's not safe in this wind, but it's possible. With 2 men. Then you need to get word to the bunkhouse," she said. "Can you make that crossing now, in a lull? Then wait for the lull." He nodded. He was looking at her with that expression again, the one she couldn't fully categorize, the one that sits between surprise and something else. She'd been seeing it at intervals since she came downstairs at 5:30. She chose not to examine it too carefully. She had a pot to manage. "What about the food?" he said. "The bunkhouse, they've got supplies in there, but not much. Holt, the youngest hand, he can't cook to save his life, and the others aren't much better. I told you last night I'd have something ready for them," she said. "I meant it. When the lull comes, you can take the pot, or someone can come get it. I'll have it ready." He was quiet. "Then you organized all of this before 6 this morning." "I organized it when I heard the wind at 3, she said. "I just needed the daylight to start executing." "You said that before. That you planned instead of panicking." "I wasn't always like that," she said, because that was the honest thing to say, and she'd decided fairly early in her adult life that honesty cost less in the long run than its alternatives. When my husband got sick, the first weeks I panicked. I did everything wrong. I spent energy on the wrong things. I worried about things I couldn't change. I let the things I could change slide. She turned back to the pot. You learn or you don't, and if you don't, things get worse. Nathan didn't say anything for a moment. Then his name was Thomas. Yes. How long were you married? 14 years. She felt him absorb that number. Most people, when she said it, went quiet in a specific way, the way of people calculating how much ground that covered and recognizing it was a lot. I was married 11, he said. She had known the letter had mentioned it. The children's mother, the 18 months. But this was the first time he'd said anything of it himself, and she didn't respond in the way that would make him regret having said it. She just nodded once. Her name was Ruth, he said. That's a good name, Margaret said. He didn't answer that. He put his coffee cup down on the counter and went back to his office, and she thought that was probably exactly as much of that conversation as either of them could manage right now, and that was fine. Some things took a long time to say, and you had to say them in pieces. The lull came at 10:30. It was brief, maybe 12 minutes of wind dropping from a roar to a moan, and Nathan used it. He went to the bunkhouse with the pot Margaret had ready and a message. 2 men to the barn. Follow the fence. Check the horses and break the ice on the trough. Then get back inside. Came back 20 minutes later with snow in his eyebrows and his hands red raw, and reported that Caleb had already thought of the barn and had sent 2 men out before Nathan got there. He beat you to it, Margaret said. He usually does on ranch things, no resentment in it. Just fact. She handed him a cloth to warm his hands on and went back to the stove. The ham pot was doing exactly what she needed it to do. The smell coming off it now was something genuine, something with body and warmth. And Clara had drifted to the kitchen doorway twice already without saying why. Smells good, Nathan said. The same thing Clara had said the night before. It seemed to be the Hale family's particular way of saying something larger. It'll be ready by noon, Margaret said. Send word to the bunkhouse they can come in relays, 2 at a time if the wind stays low enough. Or I can send the pot over again. I'll send word, he said. And then after a pause, Caleb wanted to know who organized the cellar supplies. She looked up. What did you tell him? I told him you found the hams this morning. What did he say to that? Nathan's expression was difficult to read, which she was coming to understand was his natural condition. He said he was aware there was a cellar. I'm sure he was. He didn't say anything else about it. She nodded. All right. He's not going to apologize, Nathan said, for what he said yesterday, when you arrived. In case you're waiting for that. I'm not waiting for it, she said. I've got too much to do. Nathan almost smiled. It was the first time she'd seen anything approaching it, and it changed his face, considerably made him look younger, made the dark circles less definitive somehow. It was there for about 2 seconds, and then it was gone, but she'd seen it. By noon, the ham was ready, and the kitchen had become the center of gravity for the entire occupied part of the house. Clara had given up any pretense of reading and was sitting at the kitchen table, watching Margaret work with an attention that was something more than idle curiosity. It was the attention of a girl who was trying to learn something and wasn't quite ready to admit it. James and Danny had migrated to the kitchen doorway, their conversation about horses having evolved into something that involved a lot of gesturing, and at one point a reenactment of what Danny described as the way a horse acts when it doesn't want to be ridden. James evaluated with serious technical critique. Margaret let all of this happen around her. She'd learned from the boarding house, from years of a household with Thomas's large, difficult family coming and going, that a kitchen that was working properly had a particular gravity to it. People came toward warmth and food and industry the way they came toward fires. You didn't have to invite them. You just had to keep the fire going. She was ladling out bowls when Clara said, without looking up from the table where she'd been watching the pot, "My mother used to do that." Margaret didn't stop ladling. Do what? Cook like that, where you're doing 5 things at once, but it doesn't look like rushing. Your mother sounds like she was a good cook. She was. A pause. Are you today? I am, Margaret said. There have been days I wasn't. Ask me again after the storm. Clara looked at her. Then she almost smiled, the Hale version of smiling. That brief 2-second thing, and said, all right. Nathan came in from outside. He'd gone to check the bunkhouse situation again in another brief lull and stopped in the doorway of the kitchen looking at the scene. Margaret serving bowls, Clara actually handing them to people, James and Danny both now fully inside the kitchen and sitting on the floor in the corner. Because there was enough chair space, and the room warm enough that everyone had taken off their extra layers. He stood there for a moment too long, and Margaret saw why. This was what the kitchen had looked like before. Before Ruth. Before the last 18 months of managed absence and grief and wrong organized furniture and damp wood boxes. She didn't say anything. She handed him a bowl. He took it and sat down. The storm made its second argument at 2 in the afternoon. The wind, which had been variable all morning, found a new direction and committed to it out of the northwest, driving hard, and with it came a sound against the north wall of the house that Margaret had not heard before, a deep, low thrumming, not the rattling of windows or the bang of shutters, but something structural, the house itself being pushed. Temperature dropped visibly and quickly. The fire in the main room, which had been holding well, started working harder than it should have needed to. Nathan was on his feet before Margaret was. He went to the north wall of the main room and put his hand flat against it and stood there for a moment with his face tight. "We're getting snow coming in somewhere," he said. "Upper story. There's a gap in the eave on the north-facing roof. I've been meaning to fix it since September. What does that mean for us now? It means the upstairs is going to get wet and cold, and we need to make sure nothing critical is up there." He looked at the ceiling. Children's rooms. Extra blankets. Anything that can't get wet. Clara was already at the foot of the stairs. "I know where everything is," she said. "You're not going up alone," Nathan said. "I'm 10, she said, with the particular contempt of a 10-year-old who has been making independent decisions since the age of 8, whether anyone liked it or not. "I know the house. I'll be faster than you." Nathan looked at Margaret, which surprised her, the involuntary look of a person seeking a second opinion from someone they've started trusting without consciously deciding to. "Let her go," Margaret said. "She's right that she'll be faster. But tell her what to bring, don't make her guess." "Blankets from the cedar chest," Nathan said to Clara. "Extra stockings in the top drawer of my room, the children's gloves, and there's a canvas oilcloth in the closet at the end of the hall. Bring all of that." "What about James's soldiers?" Clara said. "He'll lose his mind if they get wet." James, from the kitchen doorway, said, "I won't lose my mind." "You'll definitely lose your mind," Clara said, and went upstairs before he could respond. The exchange took about 15 seconds, and in those 15 seconds something loosened slightly in the room. Not the storm, not the cold, but the human barometric pressure of 4 people in a house who'd been holding themselves carefully around each other. James went back to Danny in the kitchen. Nathan went to the fireplace to add wood. And Margaret, watching all of this from her doorway, felt something she hadn't expected to feel on her second day at this ranch. She felt like she was somewhere she might eventually belong. She put that thought away quickly. It was too early for thoughts like that, and she had too much to do. Clara came back downstairs with everything on the list, plus James's soldiers in a pillowcase and a stuffed cloth rabbit that she handed to Danny without explanation. Danny took it, looked at it, and looked at Clara. "It was from the spare room," Clara said, with the elaborate casualness of a child performing not caring. "Just sitting there." Danny held the rabbit. He didn't say thank you, which under other circumstances, Margaret might have nudged him about. But she recognized what was happening. He was trying to figure out if this was something that could be taken back, if it was safe to receive it. He was 7, and he'd lost his father, and he didn't entirely trust gifts yet. "Thank you," Margaret said to Clara, "because someone should." Clara shrugged, went to return to her book, and Danny, after a moment, tucked the rabbit next to him against the chair arm, and Margaret looked away before he could see her looking. Afternoon was the hardest stretch. Not because anything catastrophic happened, it didn't, but because there's a particular kind of duration that a blizzard imposes on people that has nothing to do with physical danger. The duration of time with limited motion, limited distraction, limited horizon. People who are used to being able to walk out a door and into the world suddenly discover that the walls are a specific distance apart and not likely to move. James hit a doorframe at 2:30. Nobody said anything. He hit it again at 3:15, harder. "James," Nathan said from his chair by the fire where he'd been going through papers. "What?" James said. "Come sit down." "I don't want to sit down." "I've been sitting down all day." "I know. Come sit down anyway." James crossed his arms and stood in the middle of the room, performing extreme stillness as a form of protest. Danny, who had been watching this with the particular interest of a child who is learning how a different family operates, said nothing. "Margaret from the kitchen," said James. "Can you come in here a minute?" Pause. "Why? Because I need someone to tell me if this smells right." Another pause. Then feet on the floor, moving toward the kitchen. She'd taken the dried apples from the cellar, and she was doing something simple with them, cooking them down with a little of the lard and the last of the brown sugar she'd found on the pantry shelf. Not quite a pie, not quite a dessert, more like stewed apples with ambition. She held out the spoon to James, who sniffed it, then tasted it. "Needs more sugar," he said. "We're out of sugar." "Then it's fine," he said, which was a version of "it's good" from a boy who didn't want to be caught approving of something he'd been brought in here to distract from. He stood beside her at the stove for a moment. "What are you making it for?" "Supper, something sweet at the end. It helps." "Helps what?" "A long day," she said. "A cold house. Being stuck inside." She stirred it. "Your dad said your mom was a good cook." James went still. Not the tense stillness of a boy about to hit something, but a different kind. "Wheater," he said that, not those exact words, but something like it. James looked at the pot. "She made apple cake sometimes." "In the fall." "What kind?" "Just regular apple cake." "With cinnamon." She didn't really measure anything. "The best cooks never do," Margaret said, which was partly true and partly something to say that would let the conversation keep moving at whatever speed it wanted. James stirred the apples himself for a moment, with the solemnity of a child performing a task that is actually something else. Then he handed the spoon back and went back to the main room. Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway 30 seconds later. Margaret suspected she'd been listening from the hall. "You did that on purpose," Clara said. "Did what on purpose?" "Called him in here. He was about to do something bad to that doorframe. I needed someone to taste the apples." Clara looked at her with that precise evaluating gaze. "You're good at that." "At cooking?" "At people," Clara said. Not like a compliment. More like a finding the conclusion of an observation she'd been conducting since yesterday afternoon, and had finally reached a definitive result on. Margaret didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and after a moment, Clara went back to her book. The bunkhouse men came in relays at 4 o'clock. Nathan had managed a message over in one of the brief lulls, and Caleb had organized it. 2 men at a time, 20 minutes each, rotating until everyone got warm and fed. The first 2 were Holt, the young one who'd been standing with Caleb in the yard the day before, and an older hand named Gruber, who spoke very little English and communicated primarily in nods and eyebrow movements that were surprisingly precise. Margaret served them both at the kitchen table without comment. She filled the bowls properly, not shortchanged. She put bread on the table she'd made it that morning while the hams was starting, a plain loaf with no pretensions, and she let them eat in peace. Holt ate like a man who had been thinking about a hot meal since before the storm hit, which he probably had. Gruber ate with careful deliberateness, and when he finished he nodded at Margaret in a way that she understood to mean something in the range of "this was good. Thank you." She nodded back. When they were going back out, Holt paused at the door. He was the one who'd been standing next to Caleb yesterday, the one who'd maybe almost laughed when Margaret had refused Caleb's version of his name. "That's the best thing I've eaten since I got to this ranch," he said. "Been here how long?" she asked. 4 months. "That's a long time to eat poorly," she said. He grinned a young man's grin, unpracticed and genuine. "Mrs. Dunmore, the last one. She cooked like she was doing you a favor. I'll try to do better than that." "You already did, ma'am," he said, and went back out into the white. Caleb Rourke came in with the last rotation at 5:30. Storm had eased incrementally, not stopping, not finished, but the leading edge of its worst temper moving through. He came in with one other man, a quiet hand named Beaumont, and they sat at the table and ate without the ceremony of strangers. Margaret served them the same as everyone else. She sat on the other side of the kitchen, doing her inventory while they ate, not hovering, not watching. She had learned a long time ago that some men ate easier when they didn't feel supervised. Caleb finished half his bowl before he said, without looking up, "The horses are fine. In case you were wondering." "I was," she said. "Thank you for sending men." A silence. "You found the cellar," he said. Not an accusation. Just a statement with some texture to it. "This morning, yes. I knew it was there." "I'm sure you did," she said. "You didn't know there were hams in it?" He looked up. "There were hams?" 3 of them. From the fall slaughter. Kept. He stared at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully categorize. It was something in the range of "I did not know that, and I should have," which was, for Caleb Rourke, probably a significant admission to allow onto his face at all. "Hale didn't mention hams," he said. "He forgot about them." Caleb looked at his bowl. Then he said, "The broth's good." "Thank you. I'm not saying it to be friendly." "I know," she said. "You're saying it because it's true. That's fine." He looked at her with a different expression now, not the measuring hostility of yesterday, not the admission of a moment ago, but something that was still figuring itself out. She didn't push it. She went back to her inventory. Beaumont, who had not said a single word, finished his bowl and stood up. He put his hat back on. Then he said, "To no one in particular, my grandmother cooked like that," and went back out into the storm. Caleb stood a moment later. He picked up his coat. He stood at the kitchen door for a beat too long, like a man composing something, and then deciding against it. What he finally said was, "Storm should start breaking overnight. Morning might be passable." "Good to know," Margaret said. He left. She sat in the kitchen after he was gone, in the particular quiet of a house where all the important things of the day had been done, and what remained was the small continuation of keeping everything going through the night. The ham pot was down to bone and broth. The apple dessert had been eaten entirely, even the portion she'd set aside for the bunkhouse, which Holt had accepted with the expression of a man receiving something better than he'd been expecting. The children were in the main room, quieter than the afternoon, not peaceful exactly, not resolved, but tired in the way that means the day has done its work on them. Nathan came to the kitchen doorway at 7. He looked at the stove, the clean surfaces, the covered pot she'd keep warm through the night for anyone who woke hungry. "You fed 17 people today," he said. "From a pantry I thought was half empty." "It wasn't half empty," she said. "It was half organized." She dried her hands on a cloth. "And 16. "Danny counts 16, he said, including Danny. Turned down the lamp over the stove to its night setting. Outside, the wind was doing what Caleb had said, still present, but with less conviction, like an argument that was starting to run out of material. "Some sleep," Nathan said. "I'll bank the fires at midnight." "I was going to, I know what you were going to," he said. "Get some sleep." She looked at him. He was leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed, and the dark circles under his eyes were worse than this morning, which had been worse than last night. He had not slept, she suspected, since the storm hit. "Sleep too," she said, after the midnight check. "Nathan." He looked at her at the sound of his name the way men do when they've given someone permission to use it, and it still surprises them when they do. "After the midnight check," he said again, but quieter. She nodded. She took her lamp and went to the hallway and stopped at the foot of the stairs. "The ham bone's in the pot," she said. "I'll make soup from it tomorrow. It'll be better than today, if you can believe it." "I believe it," he said. She went upstairs. She checked on Danny, still breathing. Rabbit tucked under his arm, the particular slack piece of a child who has had a full day in a new place and is too tired for the usual nighttime grief, stood in his doorway for a moment, the same as every night. Then she went to her room, sat on the edge of the bed, took off her boots with the deliberate movements of someone whose feet had been going since 3 in the morning. She had cooked for 16 people through the first day of a Wyoming blizzard. She had found 3 hams nobody remembered, organized a house nobody was managing, fed a hostile foreman who hadn't said thank you and probably wouldn't, gotten 2 grieving children to taste the apples and talk about their mother, and watched a 7-year-old boy accept a stuffed rabbit from a girl he'd known for one day. She had not once in all of that been the person Caleb Rourke thought she was when she stepped off the wagon. She lay back on the bed without undressing entirely, set the lamp low. Outside, Wyoming was finishing its argument with itself. She was asleep in 4 minutes. She had told Nathan the soup would be better than the day before, and she'd meant it, but she hadn't anticipated waking to find that the storm had changed its mind about leaving. Caleb had been wrong. Not about the direction of it, the wind had shifted, the way he said it would, but about what that shift meant. At 4:30 in the morning, when Margaret came awake, without an alarm, the way she always did, when something wasn't right, she lay still for 30 seconds listening and understood that the storm hadn't broken overnight. It had reorganized. The sound against the north wall was different from yesterday, lower, more sustained, less furious, but somehow more serious. A man who had stopped shouting and started talking in a quiet voice that meant he had settled in and was prepared to be patient about this. She got up. She dressed. She went to the hallway window first, before the stairs, because she'd gotten into the habit of reading that window the way she'd read the storm glass 2 nights before. White, completely white. The gray pre-dawn light that normally outlined the shapes of the yard, the fence posts, the lean-to, the corner of the bunkhouse was simply absent. There was nothing beyond the glass but moving white, and the moving was the particular movement of snow that isn't falling so much as being transported, carried horizontally in the kind of sustained blow that turns the world flat and featureless and takes away your ability to judge distance or direction. This was worse than yesterday in at least one way that mattered. Yesterday you could see. Today you could not. She went downstairs. The kitchen was cold in a way that told her the midnight fire check had not included the kitchen stove. Nathan had banked the main room fire. She could feel the difference. The kitchen had dropped several degrees overnight and was only now at the particular cold that reminded her of walking into a cellar. She got the stove going without lighting a lamp first, working by feel and memory, because she'd learned the geography of this kitchen in 2 days, the way she'd always learned spaces, by moving through them enough times to have them in her hands and feet rather than just her eyes. Fire caught. She stood over it. Then she went to assess what the night had changed. The north-facing window above the kitchen sink had a problem. She discovered it when she went to the pump. The pump itself was fine. No freeze, because the kitchen stayed warmer than the rest of the ground floor. But when she looked at the window above it, she saw the rag that had been stuffed into the cracked lower pane was no longer sufficient. Overnight the crack had extended, probably from the temperature drop, and there was now a thin, steady inflow of air coming through it that wasn't quite a draft, but wasn't nothing either. The rag was half out. She found rags in the lower cabinet, where she'd also found the extra lard and the dusty tin of baking powder. Packed the crack more thoroughly, using 2 rags, and pressing them into the gap with the handle of a wooden spoon until she felt the inflow stop. It wasn't a fix. It was a management of the situation, which was what most things in a blizzard came down to. She was starting the soup. The ham bone from yesterday had been waiting in the covered pot exactly where she'd left it, and she added the soft potatoes she'd set aside from the cellar, and the green beans from the first crock she'd opened, and the last of the dried herbs she'd found in a tin on the pantry shelf when she heard Nathan on the stairs. He came into the kitchen already dressed, coat in hand, and stopped at the window. It didn't break, he said. No. He looked at the window, looked at the repaired crack above the sink. He'd noticed it, but he didn't comment on it yet. I was wrong about the timing. Weather's hard to predict here, she said. I'm usually better at it. He said this the way a person says something they believe is true and are frustrated to find isn't true today. Pulled his coat on. I need to get to the bunkhouse. In this, he said. Same flat certainty as before. Worse visibility than yesterday, but the rope's still tied. I know the distance. She didn't argue. She'd established her position on that already. I'll have something ready for them. How long before you're back? 20 minutes. Maybe 30 if I need to check the bunkhouse stove. I'll have coffee ready, and the soup started. Be careful on the porch. The boards were slick at 3 this morning, and they're worse now. He paused at the door, that micropause she'd been noticing. You were up at 3? I heard something. Went back to sleep. She stirred the pot. The second board from the door. It's lifted at the left edge. Don't put your full weight on the left side of it. He looked at her for a moment and then went out, and she heard him testing the boards carefully on the way to the post, and she went back to her soup. The morning revealed itself incrementally, which was the thing about blizzard days that nobody who hadn't lived through one ever quite understood. They weren't dramatic all the way through. They had long stretches of sustained grimness that demanded a different kind of endurance than dramatic peaks did. Not courage, exactly, but stamina, the ability to keep doing the necessary things without the motivation of crisis to push you. James hit a doorframe at 7:15. Clara said with profound weariness, James. I'm fine, James said. You're not fine, you're bored. I'm fine and bored. Danny, sitting in his corner chair with the rabbit and a piece of paper he'd asked for to draw on, said without looking up, At home I used to count the bricks on the wall when I was bored. James looked at him. We don't have brick walls. I know. Count the boards. A long pause. How many bricks did your wall have? James said. I never got to finish counting. I always fell asleep before the end. James appeared to consider this seriously as a strategy. Then he went to the nearest wall and started counting boards from the corner, pointing at each one with a finger, murmuring numbers. He made it to 47 before losing count and started over. He made it to 63 the second time, then looked back at Danny. It's working, he said, with the tone of a man who had discovered penicillin. Clara put her book down and looked at Margaret in the kitchen doorway, and this time her almost smile lasted a full 3 seconds. Nathan came back at 8:15, later than he'd said, and the additional time was visible on him. The snow that had accumulated on his coat was heavier than it should have been for the distance he'd covered, which meant the crossing had been harder than the previous day. He stood on the porch for a moment, knocking the snow off before he came in, and when he came through the door, Margaret already had the coffee poured and was putting it on the table. He sat down heavily, not dramatically, just with the weight of a man who had used more than he'd planned to on the walk. Bunkhouse stove needs a part, he said. Margaret looked up. The draft lever, it's been sticking since October, and I've been meaning to fix it, but the cold has made it worse. They can still run the stove, but they can't regulate it properly. It either runs too hot, or they choke it down too much, and it barely heats. How cold is it in there? Cold enough that Holt and Gruber slept in their coats last night. He wrapped his hands around the coffee. Caleb had them take turns, keeping the stove managed through the night. 2-hour watch shifts. Margaret thought about this. Can the part be fixed or fabricated? It needs a replacement part. I don't have one. Nearest place to get it is Casper. So that's not a solution for today. No, she thought for a moment. How many men are in the bunkhouse? 6 plus Caleb. The house has space, she said. Not comfortable space, but space. Could they come in, rotation basis warm up properly, eat, go back? They've been doing that. Not rotation basis. Come in and stay. For the duration. Nathan looked at her. That's 7 men in a house with 4 children. 7 men who are cold in a failing bunkhouse in a storm that isn't breaking, she said. And it's a house with a working kitchen and 2 functioning fireplaces. The math isn't complicated. He thought about it. She could see him working through the logistics, the space, the dynamics, what Caleb would say, what the men would make of it, what it meant for the children. Caleb won't like it, he said. Caleb doesn't have to like it. It's your house and your ranch. Another pause. Scott stopped. Started again. The children haven't been around that many men all at once. Not since Ruth. She understood what he wasn't saying. Since Ruth, the house had been managed as a kind of protected space. The number of people in it kept small and controlled. The intrusions of ranch life kept at the bunkhouse distance. 7 men changing that would change a lot of things at once. They managed yesterday, she said carefully. The rotation. James talked to Holt for 20 minutes about horses. Clara watched Beaumont like she was taking notes. Nathan looked at her. She does that, I know. She's her father's daughter. She said it before she thought about whether she should, and then she said it and it was said. And Nathan's face did something complicated. Can you talk to Caleb this morning? A long silence. Storm pressed against the north wall. I'll go at noon, Nathan said. In the next lull, there was no lull at noon. The storm's 3rd day had a different texture from its first 2, and Margaret felt it in the house before she could have named what it was. On the first day, there had been urgency, the scramble to organize, the discovery of resources, the management of immediate crisis. On the second day, there had been a rhythm found, a working pattern, something that almost functioned like a household, operating normally under abnormal conditions. On the 3rd day, the urgency was gone and the rhythm was strained, and what replaced them was a low, gritty endurance that showed up differently in different people. In James, it showed up as silence, which was actually more worrying than the doorframe. Stopped hitting things and started sitting very still with an expression she associated with a child who has run out of ways to be angry and is now just sad, which is a different problem entirely. In Clara, it showed up as precision. She became almost rigid in her helpfulness, offering to set the table and carry things and be useful with a kind of relentlessness that Margaret recognized as a child, keeping herself so occupied. She didn't have room to feel anything she didn't want to feel. In Danny, it showed up as nighttime. He'd been fine through the days better than fine. Actually, his natural quietness fitting the enforced stillness of a storm-bound house in a way that seemed almost comfortable to him. But at 9 on the 3rd night, he came and stood at the foot of Margaret's bed again, not crying, just standing. She was awake already, because she'd been listening to the storm. Can't sleep, she said. He shook his head. She moved over. Climbed in. She didn't make a production of it, didn't say anything about it, just let him settle. Sleep in 6 minutes, and she lay awake next to him, thinking about the bunkhouse and the stove part, and the fact that there had been no lull, and Caleb's men were spending their 3rd wet night in coats. At midnight, she heard Nathan on the stairs. He was going to check the fires. She heard him stop outside her door, a pause of 2-3 seconds, and then continue down the hall. She thought he'd probably seen the crack of light from her lamp and known she was awake, but decided correctly that she was fine. Put out the lamp and slept. Morning of the 4th day arrived with a quality of light that was different from the previous 3. Not good light, not clear light, but less absent light. The white beyond the windows had texture to it. She could see the shapes of fence posts, ghostly and indistinct, but present. The wind had dropped enough that the low, sustained thrumming against the north wall had gone, replaced by intermittent gusts that came and went with gaps between them. The storm was running out of itself. She stood at the hallway window for a moment before going downstairs, watching the fence posts establish themselves gradually in the gray light. 2 days ago, they'd been invisible. Yesterday, they'd been nothing. Today, they were there, faint, uncertain, but there. She started the stove. She was well into the morning's cooking. The ham bone broth was gone. She'd shifted to dried beans with the remaining salt pork and the last of the preserved beets for color. And because beets in the pot gave a richness that surprised people who hadn't had them that way when she heard the knock at the kitchen door. Not the front door. The kitchen door, which was the door that connected to the back porch, and from there to the path toward the bunkhouse. She opened it. Caleb Rourke was standing on the back porch. He was wearing 2 coats, his own, and what appeared to be a second one, borrowed from someone larger. His face was reddened from cold in a way that 3 days of improperly heated bunkhouse would explain, and there was a tiredness around his eyes that was distinct from his usual expression. He was not a man who showed discomfort easily, and the fact that it was showing now told her more than he probably intended. "Stove draft," he said. "It's completely failed. We've got a fire going, but it won't sustain, keeps smothering." She looked at him. "Come in," she said. I just need to tell Hale. He's not up yet. Come in and get warm while I go get him." A pause. Caleb Rourke standing on a back porch in 2 coats in a Wyoming blizzard, deciding whether to accept something from a woman he'd dismissed on sight 4 days ago. Calculation happening behind his eyes was not a small one. Came in. She pointed at the table he sat. She poured coffee and set it in front of him and went to the stairs. Nathan was already awake. She could hear him moving in his room, and she knocked once and told him through the door that Caleb was in the kitchen and the bunkhouse stove had failed. Came back downstairs. Caleb was holding the coffee in both hands and not drinking it yet, just using it for heat, which told her more about the state of the bunkhouse than anything he'd said. "How cold is it in there?" she asked. "Cold enough," he said. "How long has the stove been failing?" "Draft lever gave out completely around midnight. We've been in shifts feeding the fire, but he stopped." Something in his face that was close to admitting something. "It's not sustainable for another day." "The storm's breaking," she said. "But not today, maybe tomorrow, I know." Nathan came in. He and Caleb looked at each other with the particular wordless communication of men who've worked together long enough to have their own shorthand. Then Nathan said, "You need to bring the men in here." Caleb looked at him. "For the duration," Nathan said. "We've got room. Not comfortable room, but heated room. And Margaret's been feeding 17 people from this kitchen for 4 days. One more day won't break it." Caleb's eyes moved to Margaret. Kept her expression neutral, not a challenge, not a concession. Just present. "The children," Caleb said. "The children will be fine," Nathan said. "It's 1 day, maybe 2. Your hands won't. They're not used to being in the house. Some of them don't." He was trying to say something he found uncomfortable to say. "Holt's fine. Beaumont's fine. Gruber doesn't speak much and he's respectful. Fitch and the Daly brothers. They're rough men. They're good workers, but they're not indoor men. Nobody's asking them to be indoor men," Margaret said. "They can be themselves. They just need to be warm and fed." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he said the thing she hadn't expected him to say. "I should have done this yesterday." She didn't say anything. "The Daly brothers," he said to Nathan. "Keep them busy. Give them something to do with their hands, or they'll get restless, and restless men in a small house with children is." "I know," Nathan said. "I'll put them on the wood. The lean-to needs to be reorganized and the porch boards need securing. In the storm. Give them work and give them purpose and they won't be a problem." Caleb nodded. He stood. He looked at Margaret, and what was on his face was not an apology. She hadn't expected one, but it was something in that direction. Something that acknowledged that a calculation he'd made had been wrong, without requiring him to say the words out loud. "Pot smells good," he said. "Beans and beets," she said. "Nothing fancy. After 3 days on hardtack, and what Holt calls stew beans and beets is fancy," he said, and went back out into the white. They came in at noon. 7 men through the kitchen door tracked snow across the floor and stood in the hallway and the kitchen and the edges of the main room with the careful physical uncertainty of people who are very aware of being somewhere they don't normally belong. Gruber removed his hat immediately upon entering, which caused Holt to remove his, which caused the Daly brothers, Ed and Walt, wide men with the same broad face and the same habit of looking to the other before making decisions, to remove theirs. Beaumont had already removed his. The man named Fitch, who was older than the others and had a stillness to him that was different from quiet, kept his on until Caleb looked at him once, and then he took it off. The children appeared in the kitchen doorway like wildlife at a watering hole, present, but not committed to presence, ready to retreat if the situation changed. Danny went first. which surprised Margaret. He walked up to Gruber, who was the closest and also the largest man in the room, and said, "Are you the one who fixed the horses?" Gruber looked down at him. He had a broad face and eyes that were not unkind. He said something in German that Margaret didn't understand, but that had the tone of a yes. "My papa liked horses," Danny said. Gruber nodded. Then he reached into his coat pocket and produced, of all things, a small carved wooden figure, a horse, rough-made but recognizable. He held it out. Danny looked at it, looked at Gruber, took it. Holt, watching this, said quietly to no one in particular, "He's been carving those for 3 days." He didn't know who to give them to. James materialized fully from the doorway. "Did you make more than one?" he said to Gruber. Gruber looked at him and produced a second carved horse from the other pocket. James's face did something that was not quite the Hale almost smile, but was something equally significant. It was the expression of a child whose capacity for delight has not been entirely suppressed by grief, and Margaret turned back to her pot quickly, because that was the kind of thing you didn't let people see you see, or it stopped being what it was. The arrangement that settled into the house over the rest of that day was not organized by anyone. It emerged, the way things in houses do, when enough people are present long enough organically, with negotiation that was more physical than verbal, with adjustments made by instinct rather than committee. The Daly brothers went outside with Nathan to work on the porch and the woodpile. This was exactly right for both of them. They were not indoor men, as Caleb had said, and they came back in an hour later with the particular satisfied tiredness of men who've done physical work in difficult conditions and are not constitutionally capable of sitting still, but can rest after work in a way they can't rest without it. Beaumont found a corner of the main room and stayed in it. He was a self-contained man in a way that Margaret respected. He didn't take up more space than he needed. He didn't impose. He simply existed in the room with the equanimity of someone who has learned to be comfortable in his own company. Clara came and sat near him after an hour. He didn't address her and she didn't address him. After 20 minutes, he pulled a small book from his coat pocket. She looked at it. He turned it so she could see the cover. She said something low that Margaret couldn't hear. He answered. They read separately in the same silence for the rest of the afternoon, which was somehow its own kind of conversation. Holt and James became a unit almost immediately, which surprised nobody after the previous day's horse discussions. They established themselves at the kitchen table with a piece of rope that Holt apparently always carried and proceeded to spend 2 hours with Holt teaching James knots. Margaret worked around them, and when she needed the table, they moved to the floor without being asked. Fitch was the problem she'd been anticipating. He was not a bad man, she could feel that much, but he was the kind of man who carried old trouble with him, the way some people carry old injuries, a history that had made him careful about everything and trusting of nothing. He stood against the wall near the main room fireplace for the first hour without speaking to anyone, watching the room with eyes that were taking inventory in the way that certain kinds of experience makes inevitable. At some point, Margaret came into the main room carrying the beet and bean pot to put near the fire to stay warm, and she nearly walked into him because she hadn't expected him to be where he was. She didn't startle. He did slightly, which surprised him. "Sorry," she said. "Didn't see you." "My fault," he said. His voice was rougher than she'd expected. She set the pot on the hearthstone. "You worked the Wyoming ranges long?" 8 years. "Before that?" A pause. "Kansas. Long way to come." "Had reasons," he said, in the tone of a man who has rehearsed the response to that particular direction of questioning. "I came from Ohio," she said. "Also had reasons." She straightened. "There's coffee on the stove if you want it. Cups in the third cabinet from the left." She went back to the kitchen. 20 minutes later, Fitch came in, found the third cabinet from the left without asking anyone, and poured himself coffee. He stood drinking it by the kitchen window and watched the snow the way people watch things they're trying to stop themselves from thinking about. Margaret said nothing. She cooked. After a while, he said, "What's in the pot?" "Beans and beets. Ham bone broth underneath." He considered this. "Beets. Don't knock beets," she said. He almost did something with his mouth that could have been the start of something warmer. "My mother grew beets," he said, "back in Missouri." "Good cook?" "Terrible," he said, "but she tried." "That counts," Margaret said. He finished his coffee, rinsed the cup she noticed that filed it, and went back to the main room. He didn't stand against the wall for the rest of the afternoon. He sat in the chair nearest the fire and closed his eyes and slept the sleep of a man who hadn't slept properly in 3 days. The crisis came at 4 in the afternoon. Margaret had been expecting something 14 people in a house built for 5/3 day of confinement, the particular pressure of proximity, without enough space, and she'd been watching for where it would come from. She'd guessed Fitch or Ed Daly. She was wrong. It came from Clara. Started small. Clara had been managing her helpfulness all day with the focused relentlessness Margaret had noticed that morning, carrying things, setting things, keeping herself useful with a precision that had stopped looking like helpfulness about 2 hours in and had started looking like something closer to barely controlled desperation. And somewhere in the late afternoon, when Margaret asked her to please take the clean cups back to the cabinet, and Clara did it, and then Margaret turned around and found her standing in the kitchen with her arms at her sides and her face doing something that faces do just before they give way. Clara, Margaret said. Clara said nothing. Her jaw was set the way her father's jaw set, that same muscle doing the same work. Come here, Margaret said. I'm fine, Clara said. Father's voice. You can be fine and still come here, Margaret said. Something in Clara's face broke slightly, not all the way but at the edges. She came to the counter where Margaret was standing. Margaret didn't try to hug her. She'd learned enough about Clara in 4 days to know that wasn't the right approach, that Clara was not a girl who accepted comfort that came at her like an advance. She just stood next to her, close enough that their arms were almost touching, and kept working. Clara stood there for a moment. Then she said very quietly, she used to stand here. Margaret didn't have to ask who. She had a way of standing at the stove, Clara said, with one hand on the counter. Just like that. Margaret looked at her own hand on the counter. She didn't move it. I miss her all the time, Clara said. Sometimes I miss her more. Like today. Yeah, Margaret said. Not I know or I understand or anything that would claim more than she had a right to claim. Just, yeah. Clara stood there for another moment. Then she took a breath that wasn't quite steady and said, What can I do? Stir this, Margaret said, and handed her the spoon. Clara stirred. Her hand wasn't quite steady either for the first few strokes, and then it was. Stirred for a few minutes in silence, and Margaret worked beside her and said nothing, and let the kitchen be what it had been, since the first night, the warmest room in the house, the room where the fire was right, the room where the work continued regardless. Nathan appeared in the doorway. He looked at Clara. He looked at Margaret. His face did the complicated thing it did when he knew something had happened that he'd missed, and he wasn't sure he wanted to know all of it, and at the same time was grateful it had been handled. He didn't say anything. He went to the wood box and added 2 pieces to the firebox, which didn't need it yet, but gave him something to do in the room, and then he stayed. Caleb found Margaret at the back of the cellar stairs at 5:30. She'd gone down to bring up the last wheel of cheese, and she was standing at the bottom of the stairs holding the lantern, making herself do a final inventory what was left, what the next 2 days could be built around, whether they had enough. They had enough, not comfortably, not with any margin, but enough. She turned to go back up and nearly collided with Caleb on the 3rd step, who had come down without her hearing him. Sorry, he said. I just wanted to see what was down here. Now you know, she said. He looked at the shelves, at what remained. He was calculating. She could see a different calculation from hers, a ranch foreman's calculation that thought in terms of investment and return and resource allocation. You've been managing this very carefully, he said. Yes. Better than I would have. She waited because there was more coming. I owe you something, he said. He said it the way a man says something he has been preparing for several hours and is not going to enjoy delivering, but has committed to. Not an apology, for he stopped, started again. What I said when you arrived. That was I shouldn't have said it where you could hear. You mean you should have said it quieter. A pause. I mean I shouldn't have said it at all. That was the most she was going to get from Caleb Rourke, and she knew it, and it was actually more than she'd expected. She adjusted her grip on the wheel of cheese. I'm not easy to work around, she said, because she believed in honesty. I have opinions about how things should run, and I'm not quiet about them. I know that now, he said, dry, not unfriendly, but dry. And you're not easy either, she said. You run this ranch like it's yours, and it isn't. Something shifted in his face, not anger. Something more honest than anger. It was, he said after a moment, for a while. After Ruth died, Hale, he was in the house with the kids. Was running the operation for almost a year. And now I'm here, she said. And now you're here, he said, flat. Not an accusation, just the fact of it. She thought about that for a moment. Then she said, I'm not trying to take anything that's yours. I'm trying to keep a kitchen running and a house from falling apart while the man who owns it figures out how to be a father and a rancher at the same time. Caleb looked at her for a long moment in the lantern light. That's a fair description, he said. I know it is. They stood in the cellar for another second or two, and then she handed him the wheel of cheese. Carry that up, she said. And tell Holt there's enough for a portion each with supper if he slices it thin. He took the cheese. She took the lantern. They went back up. Supper that night was the fullest meal of the 4 days, which was counterintuitive, given that the supplies were at their lowest point. But Margaret had understood something about feeding people that had nothing to do with quantity. It had to do with arrangement, with the experience of eating together rather than merely consuming food, with the difference between a meal and a feeding. She put everything on the table at once. The beans and beet pot, the cheese, the last of the bread she'd made that morning, stewed apples from the final batch of dried stock from the cellar. She set 2 tables, the kitchen table and the main room table, pushed against the window, and she put people at them in a way that was not accidental. Nathan and Caleb at the same table, Clara next to Beaumont, James next to Holt, Danny between Gruber and Fitch. She'd chosen specifically because Gruber had the carved horses and Fitch had Missouri beats in his past, and therefore had established, without knowing it, the 2 points of contact that would sustain a 7-year-old through a meal. The Daly brothers sat together because that was where they were comfortable, and Ed Daly said grace in his own way by simply picking up his fork and saying, "Well, this looks good," with a sincerity that functioned as its own kind of gratitude. For 40 minutes, the house was not a house in a blizzard. It was just a house with people in it, eating. Margaret sat at the end of the kitchen table and ate her own bowl and listened to the sounds of it, the cutlery, the low conversations, James explaining something to Holt that involved a great many hand gestures, Clara and Beaumont evidently continuing the conversation about the book, Gruber saying something to Danny in German that Danny answered in English, and somehow they understood each other. Nathan at the far end of the main room table, talking to Caleb in low voices that were not the foreman and employer low voice, but something easier than that. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the Columbus kitchen, smaller than this one, where she'd cooked for 3 people, and felt sometimes like it was enough and sometimes like it wasn't. She thought about what it felt like when something was enough. She thought this was enough. Not perfect, the fire in the main room needed attention, and Fitch had eaten too fast the way a man eats when he's been hungry too long, and it would probably hurt him later. And James had gotten bean broth on his sleeve, and was trying to address this covertly by rubbing it on the underside of the table. And Danny had given the stuffed rabbit a name at some point today. She'd heard him tell it, and the name was Thomas, which was not something she was prepared to think about fully right now. Not perfect, but enough. It was Nathan who noticed first that the wind had stopped. He was carrying his bowl to the kitchen at the end of the meal, and he paused in the hallway and said, "Margaret," came to the doorway. "Listen," he said. She listened. The house was full of the sounds of people, low talk, movement, the fire working, the ordinary noise of a household. But underneath all of that, or rather surrounding it, where there had been for 4 days the constant voice of the storm, the low thrumming, the gusts, the sustained blow against the north wall, there was something else. Quiet, not the quiet of the storm having found a lower gear. The actual quiet of its absence. The wind had stopped. She went to the hallway window. The fence posts were visible, clearly visible, in the last gray light of the afternoon. The snow was deep. She could see from here that the drifts had built to the underside of the porch rail, but it was still snow. Not moving snow, just lying where it had been deposited, enormous and white and still. Put her hand against the window glass. It was cold. Through it she could feel nothing moving. "It's done," Nathan said. "Done," she agreed. From the main room, James said, in the voice of a child who'd been counting boards since this morning and was ready to be finished, "Can we go outside tomorrow?" Nathan looked at Margaret. She looked at him. Something passed between them that was not quite a smile from either of them, but was the thing that exists right before smile, the recognition of something shared. A 4-day thing, a hard thing, a thing they'd gotten through. "Yes," Nathan said. "Tomorrow you can go outside." Margaret went back to the kitchen. She had dishes to manage, and a stove to bank, and 14 people's worth of supper to clear. The work didn't stop because the storm did. It just changed shape. She was at the sink when she heard, from the main room, the Daly brothers laughing a real laugh, unguarded, Ed Daly making some remark that Walt found genuinely funny. And somewhere under that, Clara's voice saying something to Beaumont. Still at the table, the low, precise voice of a girl who'd spent 4 days managing herself carefully, and was maybe now letting a little of the management go. and Danny's voice, somewhere in there, saying the name of the rabbit to Gruber, explaining it Thomas. His father's name, and Gruber nodding and saying something back in German that sounded gentle. Margaret kept washing dishes. Outside the window, the fence posts stood in the still white evening, solid and clear. Storm was over. The house was full. She washed the last bowl and put it on the shelf and put out the lamp over the sink and worked on by the light of the stove fire alone, which was enough to see by if you knew where everything was, and by now she did. The morning after the storm was the kind of morning that made you understand why people stayed in Wyoming despite everything Wyoming was capable of doing to them. Margaret was at the kitchen window at first light, and what she saw stopped her in the way that things only stop you when you haven't been expecting beauty, when you've been braced for difficulty so long that the absence of it takes a moment to process. The world outside was white and absolute and still, and the mountains that she'd been told were there but had rarely seen clearly through the storm-gray sky were suddenly present in a way that was almost aggressive, enormous and sharp-edged against a sky that had gone the particular blue of cold air after weather has blown through it and taken everything hazy with it. Fence posts, the lean-to, the corner of the bunkhouse, the long line of the barn roof, heavy with snow, but there, all of it there, clear and still, and the quiet was the kind of quiet that a storm earns for you, not empty quiet, but full quiet. Quiet with all of the storm's noise finally packed away somewhere. She stood at the window for 30 seconds. That was all she allowed herself. Then she turned back to the stove. The bunkhouse men left before breakfast. Caleb had them up and moving at first light. She heard them in the hallway, the careful sounds of people trying not to wake a house, and by the time she had the stove running properly and the first coffee boiling, the back door had opened and closed 7 times. And when she went to the hallway window, she could see the line of them, crossing back toward the bunkhouse, their breath making small clouds in the cold, Caleb at the front, breaking the first trail through the drifted snow. Holt paused at the kitchen door before he went, hat in hand. "Mrs. Ellison," he said. Holt, that was. He searched for words the way young men do when they want to say something that matters and aren't practiced at it. "I'm glad you were here. For all of it. The storm. Go get warm," she said, "and tell Gruber the horses are going to be happy to see him today." Holt grinned and went. The door closed. She went back to the stove. Fitch was last. She didn't see him go. She heard the door once more, later than the others, and when she looked out the window, she saw one figure walking alone a ways behind the group, not hurrying to catch up, just walking at his own pace in the trail someone else had broken. She watched him for a moment. He'd eaten the beets last night with the careful attention of a man tasting something from a long time ago. He'd thanked her in the way that people who are not accustomed to thanking do it, not looking at her, addressing the general vicinity of the doorframe. She thought he'd be all right. She had no particular basis for that assessment beyond 4 days of watching, which she'd learned a long time ago was usually enough. The children came downstairs in a rush at 7:30, all 3 of them, with the energy of people who have been told they can go outside and have been lying in bed since 5 thinking about it. James was already in his coat before breakfast. Margaret made him take it off and eat first, which he did with the focused efficiency of someone getting an obligation out of the way. Danny ate more slowly, looking out the window. "How deep is it?" he said. "Depends on where you stand," Nathan said. He'd come in from an early check of the yard and was on his second coffee, sitting at the table with the particular quiet tiredness of a man who has been running on inadequate sleep for 4 days and is beginning to feel it now that the crisis has passed. The drifts are up to the porch rail in places. Out in the open, it's probably 3 feet, maybe a little more. 3 feet, Danny said, with the reverence of a child who has never encountered 3 feet of snow. "You'll be up to your middle," James told him, with the authority of a boy who had been in Wyoming winters before and considered this a point of personal expertise. "It's a lot," Danny said. "It's great," James said, which was not the reassurance Danny was looking for but was an honest report. Clara, who had been eating with the quiet competency of a person who was still processing the previous day, the conversation at the counter, her mother's hand on the stove, things she'd said, and the way they'd been received, looked at Danny and said, "I'll stay near you. The drifts can be weird." Danny looked at her. Then he went back to his oatmeal. But he ate it faster after that. Margaret let them go at 8:30 and stood on the porch watching. James went first off the porch rail and into a drift that came up to his chest, and the sound he made was the sound a child makes when a thing that has been imagined is suddenly real and exceeds expectations. Danny went off the edge of the porch more carefully, testing with one foot, and went in up to his stomach, and stood there for a moment with an expression of complete bewilderment that was so genuine and so purely 7 years old that Margaret had to look at a fence post for a moment. Clara navigated to the cleared path that Nathan had started breaking toward the barn, and from that vantage gave commentary. Nathan came and stood beside Margaret on the porch. He watched the three of them for a moment, with an expression she'd been seeing in varying forms for 4 days, but that was clearest now, in the still, cold morning, something that was not quite relief, and not quite grief, but sat right at their intersection. James hasn't been outside like that since October, Nathan said. He needed it. They all needed it. He paused. Clara, I heard some of it. What she said to you. In the kitchen, Margaret said nothing. You didn't tell me about it, he said. Not an accusation. It's a noticing. It wasn't mine to tell, she said. He looked at her. Then he looked back at the children, at Danny trying to walk through the drift and making approximately no progress, and finding this wonderful, at James building something with a dedication that suggested it would become a projectile, at Clara on her clear path with her hands in her pockets, watching both of them with a face that had some of the previous day's tightness gone from it. She hasn't talked about Ruth, Nathan said. Not to me. Not since about 4 months after. She'll come back to it, Margaret said. She's just waiting until she can do it without falling apart. She doesn't like to fall apart. Nathan was quiet for a moment. No, he said, she gets that from me. I know, Margaret said. He looked at her again, that look, the one she'd been getting and still hadn't fully categorized. You know a lot about my family for a woman who's been here 5 days. I've been paying attention for 5 days, she said. That's more than most people do in 5 years, he said, and went inside to get more coffee before she could respond to that. The days that followed the storm had a different character from anything that had come before, and Margaret felt the shift the way you feel a change in weather, not all at once, but in accumulating small details that added up to a new condition. The house was warmer, not because the weather had improved, though it had moderately, but because Nathan had spent 2 full days after the storm, fixing the things that had been broken or neglected, the gap in the north eave that had let cold air into the upper story, cracked window above the sink that she'd stuffed with rags, the woodbox arrangement that she had told Caleb about in the second day, and that had finally been reorganized to her specifications. He did these things without announcement, without asking her to tell him what needed doing. He'd apparently made his own list. Somewhere in the 4 days of the storm, cataloging the failures of the house with the same practical attention he brought to the ranch. She found him on a ladder against the north side of the house on the second post-storm morning, working on the eave with a piece of wood and a tin of pitch, and stood below him for a moment. That's the gap? She said. That's it. He drove a nail. The sound was clear and sharp in the cold air. Should have done it in September. Should have done it when it opened. Which was, he stopped. Put another nail. Ruth got sick in March. I got behind on things. You were keeping your family together, she said. I was keeping them alive, he said. That's not the same thing. She didn't argue with that because she thought it was an important distinction, and he'd earned the right to make it. She went back inside. The ranch hands had returned to the patterns of their work, with the efficiency of men who'd been through difficult weather before, and knew that the aftermath had its own demands: clearing, repairing, checking the cattle that had been in the lower pasture, accounting for losses. There had been some losses. Nathan told her at supper, 3 days after the storm, that they'd found 7 head dead in the northeast corner, which he said was less than he'd feared and more than he could afford. He said it flatly, without drama, the way ranchers talk about the costs of their work, and she received it the same way. Caleb came to the kitchen door every morning now, not in the way he'd come on the storm day desperate, backed into a corner but deliberately with purpose. He would knock, come in when she called, pour his own coffee from the pot she kept ready, and tell her what the day's work looked like. Not because she needed to know, necessarily, but because she'd proven herself the kind of person who paid attention to information and sometimes had useful things to say back. She didn't always. Sometimes she just listened. That seemed to be enough. On the 4th day after the storm, he told her that Holt had asked about helping in the kitchen. Margaret turned from the stove. Holt? He wants to learn to cook, Caleb said, with the expression of a man reporting something he has decided not to have opinions about. He's from a family of 8, and he was the youngest, and he says he never learned because there was always someone else doing it. And now? And now he's been eating your food for a week, and he says Gruber's stew is Caleb appeared to be quoting, an insult to the idea of food. Margaret considered this. Send him over on Sunday afternoons. It's the quietest time, and I can show him the basics without it getting in the way of the week. Caleb nodded. That'll keep him from bothering me with questions about onions. He asks you about onions? He asked me once whether you chopped them before or after he stopped. Anyway, Sunday afternoons. Sunday afternoons, she agreed. It was Mabel Peavy who came from town first, which made sense because Mabel Peavy had a kind of operational intelligence about the county that meant she was always where information was most needed. She arrived in a wagon with her husband on the Wednesday after the storm, ostensibly delivering supplies they'd promised Nathan weeks before, actually conducting an assessment of the post-blizzard situation with the thoroughness of a general reviewing recently contested territory. She found Margaret in the kitchen, where else, and installed herself at the table with a cup of coffee, and proceeded to ask questions that were dressed as conversation, but were actually a fairly systematic inventory. The children got through all right, she said. They did well, Margaret said. And the hands? 7 men in the house for a night and a day. We managed. Mabel absorbed this with raised eyebrows. 7 men, including Caleb Rourke. And nobody got hurt. Nobody got hurt, Margaret said. Mabel looked at her with the frank appraisal she'd deployed at their first meeting, the same one, but with something added to it now, a reassessment built on new data. Nathan said you organized the food situation during the storm. Nathan organized the ranch. I organized the kitchen. He said you found the hams. In the cellar, yes. He didn't know about the hams, Mabel said. I put those up last October, when the Hendersons brought their slaughter surplus. I asked Nathan where he wanted them stored, and he said anywhere that was out of the way. She shook her head with the weary affection of a woman who has spent many years making allowances for men who put things out of the way and then forget them. I should have told him more specifically. It worked out, Margaret said. Somebody competent found them, Mabel said. That's what worked out means. She stayed for 2 hours. Before she left, she stood at the kitchen door and looked at the room, the organized pantry, the properly stacked woodbox visible through the back window, the smooth working rhythm of a kitchen that had been brought into order, and she said, You planning to stay? I was hired to stay, Margaret said. That's not what I asked. Margaret looked at her. Yes, she said. I'm planning to stay. Mabel nodded, as if this confirmed something she'd suspected. Good, she said, and left. The thing with James happened on a Friday, 3 weeks after the storm. It was not a dramatic thing. Dramatic things, Margaret had found, were rarely the ones that mattered most. The ones that mattered most were the small ones that came when nobody was watching, and nobody had prepared for them. James had been helping her in the kitchen. He'd started doing this sporadically, without being asked, dropping in after his schoolwork was done, and finding small tasks to involve himself in. He was better at this than he let on. He had his mother's hands, Clara had said once, which Margaret had filed and said nothing about. He could chop reasonably well for 8, and he understood intuitively the logic of keeping a fire at the right level. They were working in companionable silence, her rolling pastry, him cutting dried apples into pieces smaller than they needed to be, but she didn't say so when he said, without looking up, Do you think she would have liked you? Margaret kept rolling. Who? My mother. She thought about how to answer that. She thought about it for a real moment, not a polite pause. I don't know, she said. I'd like to think so. But I don't know what she was like well enough to say. She was particular, James said. He said it with the precise vocabulary of a child, quoting an adult's description. That's what Papa says. She was particular about things. What kinds of things? How people treated each other. He cut an apple piece in half unnecessarily. She didn't like people who were rude. She didn't like people who pretended. I'm not rude, Margaret said. I try not to pretend. James appeared to weigh this against some internal standard. She would have liked that you feed people properly, he said. She said a kitchen was about caring whether people were all right. Margaret set down the rolling pin. She looked at the window for a moment, at the cold, clear day outside. Then she said, She sounds like she knew what mattered. She did, James said. Mostly. He paused. She also burned toast almost every time and just scraped it off and didn't say anything about it. Smart woman, Margaret said. You scrape it off and move forward. No point dwelling. James almost smiled. Not quite the full Hale expression, something slightly more his own. Are you going to burn toast? Probably, she said. At some point. I've been lucky so far, but the odds aren't in my favor. I won't say anything, he said. I'd appreciate that, she said. He went back to the apples. She went back to the pastry. The fire in the stove was exactly right. Neither of them said anything else for a while, And it was the right kind of nothing, the kind that happens between people who have found a comfortable space between them and don't need to fill it. Clara was harder. Not because she was hostile, she'd moved well past anything that looked like hostility by the end of the storm, but because she was precise, and precision in a child takes longer to soften than open resistance does. She watched Margaret with that constant, careful attention, filing things, revising her assessments, operating at a remove that was the distance of a girl who had been hurt by an absence and was not fully ready to trust a presence. Margaret didn't push. She had enough experience with difficult things to know that pushing rarely helped. What helped she'd found was being reliably there. She was in the kitchen every morning when Clara came down. She was there in the afternoons when Clara's schoolwork was done and the time became unstructured. She was there at night when the house settled and the particular ache of evenings, without Simeon, made itself known. She didn't make anything of being there. She just was. The shift, when it came through the book. Beaumont had left the small book behind when the bunkhouse men returned to their quarters after the storm. Clara had kept it without saying anything about it, and Margaret had seen her reading it in the evenings, a collection of essays she'd gathered from the spine, though she hadn't asked. One evening Clara came to the kitchen doorway while Margaret was doing the last of the cleaning and said, "Have you read Emerson?" So Margaret said, "A long time ago." "He says that imitation is suicide," Clara said. "I didn't understand it at first." "What do you think it means now?" Clara considered. "I think it means you can't be someone else, even if that person was better than you. You can only be what you actually are." Margaret wrung out the cloth and hung it on the hook. "That's a fair reading. Do you think that's true?" "I think it's true, and I think it's hard," she said. "Because sometimes the person you actually are is not who you want to be yet. You're still becoming them." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I look like my mother. Everybody says so. I've heard that, but I'm not her." A pause. "I keep thinking I should be. I should take over what she was." She stopped. This was clearly something she'd been working toward for a while, and the working had not been easy. 10, Margaret said. Not unkindly. Just the fact laid down. "I know, your job at 10 is not to be your mother. Your job at 10 is to be 10 and do it as well as you can." Clara looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means read your Emerson. Help in the kitchen when you want to, and don't when you don't. Fight with James about what constitutes an observation versus a complaint. Figure out what you think about things." She paused. "Let your father take care of you for a little while longer before you decide you have to take care of him." Clara's face did something complicated. "He needs taking care of." "He's getting it," Margaret said, quietly. "Just a statement." Clara looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up the book from the table and went back to the main room. Margaret turned back to the sink. She heard, from the other room, Clara say to Nathan, "Papa, have you read Emerson?" Nathan said he had some. Clara said, "I think you should read it again." Margaret heard Nathan make a sound that was fully, unambiguously a laugh, not the almost smile. Not the 2-second flicker, a real laugh, and it transformed the sound of the house. She stood at the sink and listened to it. 3 weeks after the storm, Caleb Rourke said the thing that told her the ground had shifted. He said it sideways, the way Caleb said everything that cost him something. They were both in the yard. He was coming from the barn. She was coming back from the smokehouse, where she'd been assessing the remaining cured meat, and they arrived at the same point, near the back porch, at the same moment, and fell into step together, for the 15 feet between the outbuilding path and the door. "Fitch asked me something," Caleb said. She waited. "He asked me if Mrs. Ellison was permanent." "What did you tell him?" "Told him I didn't know." "That's accurate," she said. He said. Caleb stopped at the porch steps. He was looking at the mountain line, the way he looked at things when he was saying something. He was monitoring himself saying. He said that you reminded him of his mother, in the way that you run a place. Worth running. Margaret put her hand on the porch rail. The wood was cold and solid. He said his mother's place fell apart. After she was gone, Caleb continued. Because nobody thought it was worth the effort, and it was just a house after that. He cleared his throat. Fitch is not a man who says things like that. So I'm telling you, because he seemed to be deciding how to finish that sentence. Because you should know it. She looked at him. His jaw was set in the way it set when he'd done something difficult and was not going to explain further. Tell Fitch thank you, she said. Tell him yourself, Caleb said. He's in the barn. She nodded. He went inside. She stood on the porch for a moment in the cold, clear afternoon and looked at the mountains, which were still there, still enormous, Still entirely indifferent in the way of things that have been here longer than anyone and will be here after everyone is gone. She was not indifferent. That was the difference. She was here, and she meant to be here, and she cared about the specific people inside that house in the specific way that you care about people when you've kept a fire going for them through 4 days of a Wyoming blizzard and watched them show you who they were under pressure. She went inside. Nathan asked her to stay on the last evening of January. He did not phrase it the way she'd half expected, if she'd been expecting it at all, not as an employer keeping a useful employee, which was what the original arrangement had been, and which would have been a straightforward thing to say. He phrased it wrong, actually, in the way that people phrase things when the words they reach for aren't quite the right size for what they're trying to hold. They were in the kitchen. She was finishing the last of the supper cleanup. The children were in bed. The house was quiet. He'd come in after doing the final fire check, the thing he did every night now without her having to think about it, and stood for a moment, too long in the kitchen doorway, which she'd come to recognize as his particular way of composing himself before saying something he hadn't rehearsed. "I need to talk to you about the arrangement," he said. She set down the bowl, turned. "The original terms," he said. "The letter. The wages and the room and board, I want to adjust them." So. "I want to pay you more," he said. "What I offered in the letter was what I'd paid Mrs. Dunmore, and Mrs. Dunmore did the work differently. Less of it." He was looking at the table rather than at her. "And I want to," this is harder to say, she waited. "I don't want to have a conversation in 6 months where you tell me you're leaving," he said. "I don't want to have the conversation where you've found something better, or you've had enough of Wyoming, or—" He stopped. "I want you to stay. Not just because the kitchen runs right, and the house is warmer, and Clara is talking again. Those things matter, but they're not." He stopped again. He was not a man who talked in incomplete sentences normally, and the incompleteness was telling her more than the sentences themselves. "Nathan," she said. He looked up. "Why don't you say what you mean?" she said, "instead of what you think you're supposed to say." A long moment. Outside, a wind moved across the yard, not the storm's wind. Just a winter wind, ordinary and brief. "You've made this a home again," he said. "I didn't know it had stopped being one until you made it one again. And I don't want to lose that." He looked at her directly now. The dark circles were still there. Still the marks of a man who'd been carrying too much for too long. There was something else there, too. Something that was making its way back from wherever grief had pushed it. I'm not saying more than that. I know it's been 5 weeks. I know what you're not saying," she said. "And I'm not saying it either." "All right," he said. "But I'll stay," she said. "That part I can say." He looked at her. Something in his face settled, not dramatically, not with the relief of someone who'd been holding their breath and could finally exhale, but quietly, the way a house settles in the evening, when all the day's movement is done. "The wages," he said. "We can talk about that tomorrow," she said. "I have a counter-proposal." "You have a—" He blinked. "Of course you do." "I want proper access to the housekeeping budget," she said. "Not requests through you every time I need to resupply the pantry. A quarterly amount. My discretion, how it's spent within reason. And accounting at each quarter so you can see where it went." Nathan looked at her with the expression of a man who has been outmaneuvered before he understood there was a game. "That's a substantial amount of trust for a woman who's been here 5 weeks. I found 3 hams in your cellar that were keeping your ranch fed during a 4-day blizzard," she said. "You can trust me with a pantry budget." He was quiet for a moment. Then, quarterly accounting. "Quarterly accounting," she agreed. "Fine," he said. He pushed back from the table. "Get some sleep. James wants to show you something he and Holt figured out with the rope knots tomorrow morning, and I've been told it's going to take a while." "What kind of something?" "I've been instructed not to say. Apparently it's a surprise." He put on his coat. "He practiced it 4 times today and checked 3 times whether you'd seen him practicing." Margaret thought about James, who burned with the particular urgency of an 8-year-old who needed to show people things. "Tell him I haven't seen anything." "I did tell him that," Nathan said. "He didn't believe me. He asked Clara to verify." "What did Clara say?" "She said she didn't know what he was talking about," Nathan said, in the specific tone she uses when she absolutely does know. He went to the door. "Paused Margaret," he said. "Just her name." The way he said it now, with the weight of weeks rather than the tentativeness of that first evening. "Nathan," she said. He nodded once. The way he'd nodded the first night when she'd asked him to call her by her first name, and the gesture carried something different now. More. She couldn't have said exactly what more meant, and she thought that was right, that some things earned their meanings slowly and shouldn't be rushed. He went out. She heard the porch boards, careful on the second one left edge, the sound of his boots crossing the yard to do whatever final check he did before bed. Put out the kitchen lamp, stood in the dark for a moment, knowing the room well enough by now to stand in it without light. The stove was banked correctly. The woodbox was full. The pantry, organized and inventoried, held enough for the week, and then some. Thought about Thomas for a moment, the way she thought about him every night, not in grief anymore. Or not only in grief, but in the way of someone who has been important enough to carry with you, whose absence is a fact you've made peace with, even if it's still a weight. She thought about Columbus, the foreclosed house, the letter sent into the dark. She thought about what Mabel Peavy had asked her. You planning to stay? She went to Danny's room. He was asleep with the rabbit Thomas. The rabbit tucked under one arm and the wooden horse Gruber had carved tucked under the other, which was the arrangement he'd landed on and maintained for 3 weeks with great seriousness. She stood in the doorway and listened to him breathe. He'd asked her 2 days ago if they could stay. Not whether she was planning to, not what was going to happen. He'd come to her in the kitchen in the after-school hour and said, with the directness of a child who has run out of patience for indirection, Mama, "Are we staying here?" She'd looked at him. "What do you think?" "I think yes," he said. "James showed me how to do the fence latch." "You don't learn the fence latch unless you're staying." "That's solid reasoning," she said. "So we're staying?" "We're staying," she said. He'd nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose assessment has been officially confirmed and gone back to whatever he'd been doing. Just like that. The way 7-year-olds resolve large things that adults make complicated by deciding the answer and moving on. Closed Danny's door softly and went to her room. She was not the same person who had stepped off a wagon in this yard 5 weeks ago, with her knuckles scraped from moving a coat rack and Caleb Rourke's voice still in her ears. She was not better. Necessarily, she was the same in the ways that didn't change. The same determination, the same competency, the same bone-deep stubbornness that her mother had called a character flaw, and her aunt had called a survival mechanism, and Thomas had called the thing he loved most about her. She was different in the ways that 5 weeks of a particular kind of living make you different. She'd been seen. Not appraised, not evaluated, not weighed and found wanting or sufficient actually seen. The way people see each other when they go through something hard together and discover who everyone is on the other side. She sat on the edge of her bed and took off her boots. Her feet ached, as they always did at the end of the day. Didn't change. Through the wall she could hear the house. Not sound exactly, she could hear the house. The way you hear a place that you know, its particular sets of silences, the quality of its settled warmth, the way the floorboards had their own language that she'd learned to read over 5 weeks. It was an old house. Imperfect and drafty in the places that Nathan hadn't fixed yet, and that she'd made a mental list of, and it had been a sad house when she arrived. Grief organized and poorly heated and running on effort rather than ease. It wasn't a sad house tonight. She lay back on the bed. The window was dark, and the mountains behind it were invisible again, swallowed by the night. But she knew where they were. She'd learned their shapes now, the specific peaks she could see from the kitchen window in the morning, and from the hallway window at dusk. And knowing where something is, even when you can't see it, is a different kind of knowing than seeing it. More certain, more yours. She closed her eyes. Outside, Wyoming was simply Wyoming tonight, cold and enormous and indifferent in its magnificent way, not asking anything of anyone, just being what it was. She had 5 weeks in this place. She had 3 hams found in a cellar, and a cracked window repaired with rags, and a fire kept through 4 days of the worst weather the country had offered this winter. She had a 7-year-old son asleep with a stuffed rabbit, named for his father, and a carved wooden horse and the knowledge of how to work a fence latch. She had a 10-year-old girl who had said the word mother to her in a kitchen, and then come back the next morning and asked what she could do. She had a man who had said, "You've made this a home again," and meant it the way people mean things when they've stopped performing what they're supposed to feel and started saying what they actually feel instead. It was not everything. It was not finished. It was the beginning of something that was still figuring out what it was, and that was fine, because she had learned from Thomas, from Columbus, from 11 days in a rattling wagon heading toward a ranch. She'd never seen that beginnings are not small things. Beginnings are enormous. They contain everything that comes after. She was asleep before the last of the stove's warmth had settled into the upstairs air, and she slept the way she'd slept on the first night, and every night since solidly, without dreams she remembered, like someone who has done the day's work and earned the right to be done with it. Spring came to the Hale Ranch the way spring comes to Wyoming, not gently, not as an arrival so much as a negotiation, winter giving ground in increments, while the land tested whether it meant it. The snow retreated from the south-facing slopes first, leaving behind the gray-brown matted grass of the previous year, and then the mud came, and the mud was its own argument, deep and serious, pulling at boots and wagon wheels and the patience of everyone who had to move through it. Margaret had been on the ranch 4 months by the time the first real warmth arrived. 4 months was long enough to have stopped noticing certain things, the weight of the silence at night, the specific cold of the kitchen at 4 in the morning, the way the mountains changed color in the late afternoon from gray-blue to something almost amber, long enough for those things to have become the texture of her life rather than observations about it. She noticed other things instead. She noticed that James had stopped hitting door frames entirely, and that this had happened so gradually she couldn't have named the week it stopped. She noticed that Clara had started leaving her bedroom door open in the evenings, which she hadn't done before, a small thing, but the kind of small thing that meant something about what a person expected from the space around them. She noticed that Danny had begun using the word home without looking at her afterward to see how she received it, which was the thing she'd been waiting for, without knowing she was waiting for it. She noticed that Nathan Hale had started laughing more easily. Not frequently, he was not a man who would ever be easy with laughter. It wasn't his nature, and she'd stopped expecting it to be. But where the laugh had been rare and brief before, a 2-second thing that closed before it fully opened, it had become more itself, more willing to last. He laughed at James's rope knot demonstrations, which had grown increasingly elaborate under Holt's instruction and now sometimes involved furniture. He laughed at the ongoing argument between Clara and James about the precise definition of an observation versus a complaint, which had become a running household debate with evolving rules. He laughed, once, at something said at the supper table, a dry remark, about a recipe that had not gone as intended, and the laugh lasted long enough that Clara looked up from her plate with an expression of cautious, hopeful attention, and James said, "What? What's funny?" with the urgency of a child who refuses to miss a joke. These were not dramatic things. Margaret had learned to distrust drama as a measure of what mattered. The things that actually changed a life were almost never dramatic. They were the ordinary accumulations: a door left open, a laugh that lasted, a boy who said the word home without looking over his shoulder. In March, Caleb brought her a problem she hadn't anticipated. He came to the kitchen on a Tuesday morning when the mud was at its worst, and the ranch hands were in various states of misery about it, and he sat down at the table with his coffee and didn't say anything for longer than usual. Margaret had learned to read his silences, the way she'd learned to read the storm glass. The quality of them told you what was coming. This one told her something uncomfortable was coming. "There's talk," he said finally. She waited, in town. Mabel Peavy passed it along. She thought you should know. He looked at the table. People are talking about the arrangement. A widow woman living on a widower's ranch. 5 months. Margaret kept her hands around her coffee cup. Kind of talk. The kind that doesn't require facts to keep moving, he said. She thought about this for a moment. It wasn't surprising she'd known it was possible, had thought about it in the abstract, had filed it under things she couldn't control, and therefore wouldn't spend energy on. But hearing it said out loud, in this kitchen that she had made hers, was different from the abstract. "Does Nathan know?" she said. "Not from me, I'll tell him," she said. Caleb looked at her. "You're not upset." "I'm not happy about it," she said. "But being upset won't change what people in town are saying. It'll only change how I feel while they say it." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "The last woman on this ranch, Mrs. Dunmore, she left partly because of that kind of talk. Got back to her family." "I don't have the same family situation," Margaret said. "I know." He picked up his cup. "I'm not telling you to do anything. I'm telling you because you should know what's out there." "I appreciate it," she said. He nodded and left, and she sat for a moment with her coffee going cold in front of her, thinking about the specific unfairness of a world that could look at a woman who had kept 17 people fed and warm through a 4-day blizzard and reduce her to the subject of speculation about what she might be doing in the evenings. She thought about it for exactly as long as it took to finish the coffee. Then she got up and started on the bread. She told Nathan that evening after the children were in bed, told him plainly, without dressing it up or making more of it than it was, the way she'd learned to tell him things. He listened. His jaw set the family expression, the muscle doing its work. "I'll go to town," he said, "and say what? That it's nobody's business." "That will make it more their business," she said. "Not less." He looked at her, then what? She had been thinking about this since morning. She'd been thinking about it while she made bread and started the beans and reorganized the upper pantry shelf and helped Danny with his letters and fielded a question from Holt about whether baking powder and baking soda were interchangeable. They were not. And she'd explained why with more patience than the question strictly required, because Holt was genuinely trying, and that counted. She had been thinking about it through all of that, and she had an answer, but the answer required saying something she wasn't sure she was ready to say, and she thought he probably wasn't either. "There's one thing that would settle it," she said. He looked at her across the kitchen table. He was not a man who needed things spelled out for him when he didn't want them spelled out, and she could see him understanding what she was saying before she'd finished the sentence. She watched the understanding arrive on his face, and she watched what came after it, which was not alarm, and was not retreat, and was not the practiced blankness of a man closing a subject. What came after it was the 2-second silence of a man arriving at something he'd already been standing near for a while and hadn't quite let himself look at directly. "It's a large answer to a small problem," he said. But he said it quietly, without the dismissal the words could have carried. "I know," she said. "I'm not suggesting it because of the talk. I'm suggesting it because it's the true thing. The talk just named the timing." "What's the true thing?" he said. He asked it the way he asked her things when he actually wanted to know. Not making conversation, not managing the moment, just asking. She considered the question seriously, the way it deserved. "That this is where I belong," she said. "That Danny knows it, and the children know it, and Caleb knows it, and Mabel Peavy knows it, and probably the whole county knows it, which is likely why they're talking." She paused. "And that you know it." He looked at his hands on the table. He had a rancher's hands, scarred and weathered, work built into them, and he looked at them for a long moment the way people look at things when they're gathering themselves. He started again. "I'm not a man who finds this easy to say." "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to find it easy. I'm asking you to say it anyway." A long moment, the fire worked in the stove. Outside, the March wind moved around the house, probing in the way March winds do not with the blizzard's conviction, but with a persistent, testing quality, as if it were still deciding. "I don't want you to leave," he said. "I haven't wanted you to leave since about the 3rd day. And it stopped being about the kitchen sometime around the end of the blizzard, I think. Maybe during it." He looked up at her. "I haven't said this kind of thing since Ruth. I'm out of practice, and I'm probably going to do it badly." "You're doing fine," she said. "I'm not finished." "I know," she said. "I'm still listening." He took a breath. "I think I love you," he said. "I'm not entirely sure of the shape of it yet, because there's a lot that's still." He looked at his hands again. "Ruth was 12 years ago, the beginning of it. I'm different now. I don't know if that means I do this differently." "Everyone does this differently," she said. "There isn't a right way. You sound sure about that." "I had Thomas for 14 years, she said. "I'm not competing with that. I'm not trying to replace it, and neither are you with Ruth. What we'd be building is its own thing." He sat with that for a moment. "Its own thing," he repeated. "From here," she said. "From this kitchen. From 3 hams in a cellar nobody remembered." The side of his mouth moved. Not the full laugh, but close to it. "You're going to be mentioning those hams for the rest of your life." "Probably," she said. He was quiet again, but it was the right kind of quiet, the full kind. The kind that meant he was deciding something, not avoiding it. "We'd do it properly," he said. "Not because of the town. Because the children, they should see it done properly." "I'd want it done properly too," she said. "In the spring," he said. "When the ground's firm enough that people can get here without losing a wagon wheel in the mud." "That's practical," she said. "I'm a practical man," he said. "I know," she said. "It's one of the things I respect about you." He looked at her across the table, and there was something in his face that she hadn't seen before, or that she'd seen in pieces. In the 2-second almost smiles, and the quiet kitchen mornings, and the way he'd said, "You've made this a home again." But that was present now, as a whole thing, clear and unguarded and a little vulnerable, face of a man who has put something down that he'd been carrying alone for a very long time. "Margaret," he said. "Nathan," she said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Brief and simple. And then he stood up and said goodnight, and went to check the fires, same as every night. The ordinary continuation of a life that had just quietly changed its shape. She sat for a moment. She thought about Thomas again, as she always did. But tonight the thought had a different quality, not the ache of absence, but something more like gratitude. 14 years with a man who had taught her what a partnership looked like, who had shown her that the unromantic daily work of two people making something together was not the lesser version of love, but the actual substance of it. She was glad she'd had that. She was glad she knew what she was looking for when she found it again. She put out the lamp and went upstairs. They were married on the 15th of May, on a Saturday when the ground was finally, reliably firm, and the mountains had lost their snow to the tree line, and the cottonwoods along the creek had gone the particular yellow-green of their first leafing. Mabel Peavy organized most of it, which was inevitable, and which Margaret accepted with the pragmatism of a woman who understood when to let someone else's competency take the lead. Mabel had opinions about every detail and was right about most of them, and when she was wrong, Margaret said so, and Mabel revised without taking offense, because she was, at her core, a practical woman who respected another practical woman. The ceremony was in the yard of the Hale Ranch because it was the right place for it. The justice of the peace came from Casper. Holt pressed his only good shirt to a standard that showed genuine effort, and Gruber wore his hat at a respectful angle, and the Daly brothers managed to look presentable in a way that clearly cost them, and Fitch stood at the back with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man attending something that reminded him of something he'd lost and was glad to see someone else have. Caleb stood beside Nathan. He'd said yes when asked without any of the performance that Margaret had expected from him, just a single nod, and then, after a moment, it's the right thing. She'd chosen to take that as the wholehearted endorsement it was, coming from Caleb Rourke. Clara was the one who had surprised her. 3 days before the wedding, Clara had come to Margaret's room, not the kitchen, not a neutral territory, Margaret's actual room, and knocked, and come in when invited, and stood with her hands at her sides, in the way she stood when she was saying something that required all of her available composure. "I want you to know," Clara said, "that I don't think of it as replacing what you're doing, what it means." "I know," Margaret said. "Thought about it a lot," Clara said, "since Papa told us. I thought about whether it was wrong, somehow, to be glad about it." She stopped. "I am glad. I just wanted to say that so you knew." "Clara," Margaret said, "come here." Clara came. And this time, the first time, in 5 months, she let Margaret put an arm around her shoulders and didn't hold herself away from it. She stood there for a moment, 10 years old in her mother's eyes and her father's jaw, and entirely herself, and she let herself be held by the woman who was going to be her stepmother. And neither of them said anything, because nothing needed to be said. James, when Nathan told him, had asked 2 questions. The first was whether anything would change about supper. The second was whether Danny would be his brother now. Nathan said supper would stay the same, and yes, Danny would be his brother. James had processed this for 30 seconds and then said, "Good, because I already told Holt he was my brother, and it would have been embarrassing to take that back." Nathan had reported this conversation to Margaret, and she had laughed in the way she didn't always let herself laugh fully without managing it. Danny had received the news with the serenity of a child whose assessment of the situation had been confirmed. He'd asked one question: could he still name the rabbit Thomas? Or would that be confusing now? Margaret told him that the rabbit's name was the rabbit's name and always would be. He'd nodded satisfied and gone to tell the rabbit. On the morning of her wedding day, Margaret stood at the kitchen window in the early light and looked out at the yard. Fence posts. The lean-to properly organized now, the wood stacked dry and covered the way she'd told Caleb it should be back in the first days. The barn with its weathered boards that Nathan was going to replace this summer, one section at a time. The bunkhouse, from which she could see smoke rising already. Holt, probably, who had become a reasonably competent cook over 4 months of Sunday afternoons, and who had appointed himself responsible for the bunkhouse breakfast. She looked at all of it and thought about strength, because strength was what this story had always been, about not her own specifically, the question of what strength actually was, which was different from what it was supposed to look like. She had been told, in various ways in various languages, all her life, that she was not the image of strength, not the right size, not the right appearance, not the right type. Caleb Rourke had said it with his voice in a ranch yard in December. Others had said it with their eyes. The world had a picture in mind, lean and hard and immediately recognizable, and she didn't fit it, and she had spent more time than she should have in her life, feeling the weight of not fitting it. What she knew now that she hadn't known then, or had known but not fully believed, was that the picture was wrong. Not wrong for everyone. Some people fit the picture and fit it honestly. Picture was not the definition. It was one example. And the definition was something else entirely. Strength was staying in a kitchen when your body wanted to stop. It was finding 3 hams in a cellar that everyone had forgotten and understanding immediately how to make them matter. It was standing in front of a hostile man on your first day in a new place and deciding not to let his assessment be the truth about you. It was sitting next to a 10-year-old girl at a kitchen counter and not reaching for her until she was ready to be reached for. It was being steady, which was different from being fearless, and being competent, which was different from being perfect, and being present, which was different from being any particular version of what presence was supposed to look like. She had not conquered this frontier. That was the wrong word and the wrong idea. The frontier didn't get conquered, it got lived in, negotiated with, survived. What she'd done was simpler and harder than conquest. She'd shown up. She'd done the work. She'd stayed when it would have been easier to leave. And she'd been exactly herself the entire time, which was the hardest thing of all, to resist becoming a smaller version of yourself in a place that keeps telling you you're too big. She was not too big. She was exactly right. She knew that now in her bones, the way you know things after they've been tested and held and proven. Kitchen was warm. The stove was right. Through the window, the mountains stood where they always stood, indifferent and enormous, and not requiring anything of her, except that she see them clearly. She turned from the window. She had a wedding to get ready for, and bread she'd started last night that needed to come out of the oven, and a son downstairs who would need breakfast before the morning got away from him, and the ordinary continuation of a life that happened to contain, today, something extraordinary. She started on the bread. When Nathan came downstairs an hour later, dressed in the good jacket she'd pressed for him the night before, he found her at the stove, flour on her hands, Danny at the table eating oatmeal with the gravity of a boy performing his part in a serious day. Nathan stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, the same way he'd stood in doorways, watching her for 5 months, accumulating the sight of her in this room. "You're baking," he said, "today." "The bread doesn't know what day it is," she said. He shook his head, came in and poured his coffee, sat down across from Danny, who looked at him and said, with great seriousness, "You look nice, Nathan." "Thank you," Nathan said. "You can call him Papa," Margaret said to Danny, the flour still on her hands. "If you want, no one's requiring it, but it's available." Danny looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at Danny, with the expression of a man who has learned, over 5 months, to let things arrive at their own pace. He didn't say anything, didn't push toward it or away from it. Danny looked at his oatmeal, thought about it with the gravity he brought to important questions. "Okay," he said, and went back to his oatmeal. Nathan looked at Margaret. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything about it, because nothing needed to be said, and they had both learned by now that the things that needed saying got said, the things that didn't need saying were better honored by silence. She took the bread out of the oven. It was good she'd known it would be. She'd made enough bread in this kitchen now to know what right felt like before you opened the oven. She set it on the rack to cool. By the time the justice of the peace arrived and the yard filled with people and Holt managed to tie his bolo tie correctly on the 4th attempt, and Gruber produced, inexplicably, a carved wooden figure of a bride and groom that he pressed into Danny's hands with the solemnity of a gift-giver who has been planning this for some time. By the time all of that happened, the bread was cool enough to slice, and Margaret sliced it, and there was enough for everyone. There always was when she was the one counting. The woman they had said would fail had not failed. But more than that, and this was the part that mattered, the part that contained whatever lesson there was to be drawn from any of it, she had not succeeded by becoming someone other than herself. She had not lost weight or hardened her edges, or performed the particular kind of frontier competency that the frontier was supposed to require. She had brought herself, the whole of herself, her knowledge and her stubbornness, and her ability to find 3 hams in a cellar, and her willingness to stand beside a crying child without filling the silence, and she had put all of that to work in a cold and difficult place, and the cold and difficult place had in time made room for her. That was what places did, when you refused to let them tell you who you were. They made room. She stood in her yard on the 15th of May, the mountains behind her, and Nathan beside her, and the children nearby, and 7 ranch hands in various states of formal effort, and she was Margaret Ellison, Margaret Hale. Now, though she would keep Ellison, too, she decided, because Thomas deserved that, and she deserved the continuity, and she was exactly, entirely, completely herself. It was enough. It had always been enough. She had just needed to get somewhere cold enough and hard enough to prove it.